Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. In the bitter winter of 1982, CIA agent Chester Hawkins received orders that would haunt him for the rest of his career. The assignment seemed routine enough when his handler Doris briefed him in a sterile conference room at Langley. Chester was 34 years old, a seasoned operative with 8 years of experience in Eastern European operations, and Prague represented just another mission in the endless chess game of Cold War intelligence. Doris was a chain-smoking woman in her 50s with steel-gray hair and the kind of penetrating stare that could extract confessions from stone. She spread a series of black and white surveillance photographs across the metal table between them, each showing the same unremarkable middle-aged man with thick glasses and a rapidly receding hairline. "Target is Dr. Václav Novak," Doris began, tapping one of the photographs with a manicured fingernail. "Works at the Institute of Physics in Prague. Our sources indicate he has access to Soviet nuclear research documents through his collaboration with Russian scientists. Intelligence suggests he's financially desperate, which makes him a prime candidate for recruitment." Chester studied the photographs carefully. Dr. Novak appeared to be the epitome of the absent-minded professor, clutching research papers and wearing the same threadbare coat in every surveillance shot. He looked harmless, perhaps even sympathetic, which Chester knew from experience often made targets more dangerous to an operative's psychological well-being. "What's my cover identity?" Chester asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "You'll be Floyd Peterson, a Canadian physics professor on sabbatical. We've established a complete academic background for you at the University of Toronto, including published research papers and genuine expertise in quantum mechanics. Your MIT education before joining the agency makes this cover particularly solid." The plan was elegantly simple. Chester would spend 3 months at the Institute of Physics, gradually building a relationship with Dr. Novak, and eventually recruiting him as a source. The Czech physicist's precarious financial situation, supporting both an elderly mother and a disabled brother on an academic salary, made him vulnerable to monetary incentives. "Any particular intelligence priorities?" Chester inquired, though he knew Doris would only reveal what he absolutely needed to know. "Soviet nuclear weapons research," she replied curtly. "Dr. Novak has been consulting on theoretical calculations for their weapons program. We need to know what they're developing and how close they are to breakthrough technologies." Chester felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and anxiety that preceded every deep cover assignment. Living someone else's identity for months at a time required a psychological flexibility that not every operative possessed. The key was maintaining enough emotional distance to remember who you really were, while becoming convincing enough in your cover to fool trained intelligence officers and suspicious academics. 3 days later, Chester crossed the Austrian border into Czechoslovakia, using his carefully crafted Floyd Peterson passport. The journey to Prague took him through snow-covered countryside, dotted with gray industrial complexes and Soviet-era apartment blocks that looked like concrete monuments to communist efficiency. Everything appeared exactly as his training had prepared him to expect: cold and oppressive, and thoroughly Eastern European. The Institute of Physics occupied an imposing brutalist building in Prague's University District, its concrete facade blackened by decades of coal smoke and industrial pollution. Chester's contact there was Professor Milan Kraus, the department head who had arranged for the visiting Canadian researcher through carefully orchestrated academic channels. Professor Krauss proved to be a tall, nervous man, with the kind of enthusiastic energy that suggested he rarely received visitors from the capitalist world. "Dr. Peterson, welcome to Prague." Professor Krauss pumped Chester's hand with obvious excitement. "We are tremendously honored to have someone of your caliber joining our research team. Your published work on quantum field applications is quite remarkable, though I must admit some of the mathematical implications are beyond my own expertise." Chester had spent weeks memorizing Floyd Peterson's fictional academic background, including detailed technical knowledge that would withstand scrutiny from genuine physicists. Nevertheless, he felt the familiar flutter of anxiety that accompanied any test of his cover identity. One incorrect detail or moment of uncertainty could unravel months of careful preparation. "Thank you, Professor Krauss. I'm looking forward to collaborating with your team and learning about the innovative research being conducted here." The Institute provided Chester with a small office on the third floor, directly across the hallway from Dr. Novak's cluttered laboratory. This proximity was no accident. Doris had worked for months through various academic intermediaries to ensure Chester's placement in that exact location. From his office window, Chester could see the gray waters of the Vltava River winding through Prague's ancient city center, with the imposing spires of Prague Castle rising like medieval sentinels in the distance. On his first morning at the Institute, Chester made his initial contact with Dr. Novak. The Czech physicist was hunched over a desk covered with research papers, mathematical equations scrawled in cramped handwriting across every available surface. When Chester knocked on the open door, Dr. Novak looked up with startled eyes behind thick glasses that magnified his expression of perpetual bewilderment. "Dr. Novak? I'm Floyd Peterson, the visiting researcher from Toronto. Professor Krauss suggested we might discuss some collaborative possibilities." Dr. Novak's English proved to be heavily accented but quite sophisticated, suggesting extensive exposure to Western academic literature. "Ah, yes, the Canadian professor. Please, come in, though I must warn you that my office is not organized according to any system that normal people would recognize." This was clearly an understatement. Research papers were stacked in precarious towers on every available surface, and the air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and cigarette smoke. Mathematical equations covered a large blackboard, and several smaller whiteboards were filled with calculations that had been erased and rewritten multiple times. Dr. Novak cleared a chair for Chester by moving a pile of scientific journals to the floor, where they joined several other similar piles. "Professor Krauss mentioned that your research focuses on nuclear physics applications," Chester said, settling into the chair and trying to appear genuinely interested rather than professionally motivated. "I'd be very interested to hear about your current projects." Dr. Novak's expression immediately became guarded, and Chester recognized the automatic cautiousness that characterized academics working under communist surveillance. Any discussion of research with Western visitors required careful navigation of political sensitivities and potential security implications. "Most of my work involves routine theoretical calculations, Doctor," Novak replied carefully. "Nothing particularly innovative or exciting, certainly nothing that would interest someone with your international reputation." Chester understood that this was likely both true and false simultaneously. Dr. Novak's official research was probably mundane, but his consultation work for Soviet weapons programs was almost certainly far more sensitive and interesting. The challenge would be gradually building enough trust to access information about the classified projects. "Of course, I understand the constraints you work under here. Perhaps we could start with purely theoretical discussions. I'm always interested in different approaches to complex mathematical problems. Over the following weeks, Chester methodically built a relationship with Dr. Novak. They began meeting for coffee in the Institute's cramped break room, discussing physics concepts and sharing carefully edited stories about their respective academic careers. Chester was particularly careful to let Dr. Novak lead their conversations, never pushing too aggressively for information that might trigger the physicist's security instincts. Dr. Novak proved to be intellectually curious far beyond his scientific specialty. He spoke knowledgeably about literature, philosophy, and history, often making references to Czech cultural figures that Chester had to pretend to understand while mentally noting them for later research. During these conversations, Chester began to notice something that troubled his professional instincts. He was genuinely enjoying Dr. Novak's company. This represented dangerous territory for an undercover operative. Chester had been extensively trained to maintain emotional distance from recruitment targets, but Dr. Novak's gentle personality and obvious intellectual integrity made it increasingly difficult to view him merely as a source to be exploited. The Czech physicist spoke about his family with deep affection, describing his elderly mother's struggle with severe arthritis and his younger brother's remarkable courage in dealing with a congenital disability that had left him partially paralyzed. The family situation was exactly what made Dr. Novak vulnerable to recruitment. His academic salary was insufficient to cover the expensive medical treatments his family required, and Chester could see the stress of financial pressure in the physicist's increasingly haggard appearance. Dark circles under his eyes suggested chronic insomnia, and his clothes showed signs of being worn repeatedly without proper cleaning. After 6 weeks at the Institute, Chester felt ready to make his first tentative recruitment approach. He invited Dr. Novak for dinner at a small restaurant near the university, choosing a location that would provide privacy for their conversation while offering excellent surveillance detection opportunities. The restaurant occupied the basement of a medieval building, with heavy stone walls and dim lighting that would make electronic surveillance extremely difficult. "Václav," Chester said, using Dr. Novak's first name for the first time. "I hope you won't consider this presumptuous, but I've noticed you seem concerned about financial matters." Dr. Novak's face flushed slightly, and he stared at his untouched plate of goulash. "It is nothing unusual, Floyd. Just the normal difficulties of academic life under socialism. I might be able to help with that situation," Chester continued carefully, knowing that this moment could either advance his mission or destroy months of careful relationship building. "I have connections with various research foundations in North America. They're always seeking brilliant physicists for collaborative projects, and the financial compensation can be quite substantial." The offer hung in the air between them like smoke from Dr. Novak's cigarette. Chester watched the Czech physicist's internal struggle play out across his expressive features, clearly weighing desperate financial need against personal principles and potential security risks. "What kind of collaborative work would be involved?" Dr. Novak asked finally, his voice barely audible above the restaurant's background noise. Chester felt his pulse accelerate. This was the moment he had been working toward for weeks, the crucial transition from relationship building to active recruitment. Primarily information sharing about general research directions in Eastern European physics. Nothing classified or politically sensitive, of course, just the kind of academic exchange that would help Western researchers understand current trends and methodologies. This was, Chester knew, a significant understatement of what Doris ultimately wanted. The CIA's true objective was gaining access to specific details about Soviet nuclear weapons research that Dr. Novak had been exposed to through his consultation work. But revealing this level of detail would almost certainly frighten away the target. Dr. Novak nodded slowly. but Chester could see the internal conflict continuing behind his thick glasses. I would need time to consider such an arrangement. Of course. Take all the time you need to think it through. As they walked back through Prague's cobblestone streets after dinner, Chester experienced a mixture of professional satisfaction and personal unease. He was successfully executing his mission according to established agency protocols, but the growing friendship with Dr. Novak was complicating his emotional response to the operation in ways his training hadn't prepared him for. That night, alone in his spartanly furnished apartment, Chester composed his first detailed progress report to Doris. He described his successful initial approach to Dr. Novak without mentioning the conflicted feelings the recruitment was generating. In the ruthless world of Cold War intelligence operations, personal emotions were considered weaknesses to be overcome rather than legitimate concerns to be addressed or analyzed. But as Chester sealed the envelope containing his encrypted message, he couldn't escape the nagging feeling that this assignment was going to test his psychological resilience in unprecedented ways. The boundary between Chester Hawkins and Floyd Peterson was already beginning to blur in subtle but disturbing ways, and he had the uncomfortable sense that the worst was yet to come. 3 weeks passed before Dr. Novak provided Chester with an answer to his recruitment proposal. During this period, Chester maintained his routine at the Institute of Physics, attending seminars and continuing his masquerade as Floyd Peterson, the visiting Canadian researcher. But his entire focus remained fixed on reading Dr. Novak's mood and behavior, searching for subtle indicators of which direction the recruitment might ultimately proceed. The Czech physicist displayed increasingly erratic behavior during these crucial weeks. He arrived at work later than usual, often appearing disheveled and distracted during their regular coffee conversations. Chester observed him spending long hours alone in his laboratory after other staff members had departed for the day, sometimes remaining until well past midnight, according to the building's security guards. Chester interpreted these behavioral changes as evidence that Dr. Novak was seriously wrestling with the moral and practical implications of his recruitment proposal. The physicist was clearly weighing the substantial financial benefits against the enormous personal risks inherent in collaborating with Western intelligence services, even under the relatively benign cover story that Chester had provided. On a cold Tuesday morning in early March, Dr. Novak appeared at Chester's office door with unusual urgency. His face was noticeably pale, and his hands trembled slightly as he clutched a steaming cup of coffee that had clearly been prepared with excessive haste. "Floyd, might I speak with you privately about a personal matter? Perhaps we could take a walk along the river where we won't be disturbed." Chester immediately recognized this as the moment of decision. The location request suggested that Dr. Novak had concluded their conversation required absolute privacy, which could only mean he was ready to discuss the recruitment proposal in concrete terms. "Of course, Václav. Let me retrieve my coat and we can walk wherever you feel most comfortable." They departed the Institute in silence, walking through Prague's university district until they reached the famous Charles Bridge. The ancient stone bridge was crowded with early morning commuters heading into the city center for work, providing perfect acoustic cover for any sensitive conversation they might need to conduct. Dr. Novak guided them to a position near one of the bridge's ornate statue-topped pillars, where the noise of heavy foot traffic would effectively mask their words from any potential surveillance. "Floyd, I have been thinking very carefully about the opportunity you described, Doctor," Novak began, his voice barely audible above the surrounding urban noise. "My financial situation has become quite desperate in recent months. My mother requires expensive medical treatments for her arthritis that I simply cannot afford on my current academic salary, and my brother's disability requires specialized care that costs more than I earn." Chester felt his chest tighten with a complex mixture of professional satisfaction and personal guilt. The recruitment was proceeding exactly according to the operational plan that Doris had outlined. But Dr. Novak's obvious emotional distress made Chester feel increasingly uncomfortable about exploiting the physicist's desperate family circumstances. "I want very much to help my family, Doctor," Novak continued, his words carefully chosen, "but I also want to establish very clear boundaries about what I can and cannot provide in any collaborative arrangement. I will not betray my country's fundamental interests or endanger my colleagues at the Institute. If your research foundation can accept those ethical limitations, then perhaps we can develop some form of working relationship." The terms were actually more favorable than Chester had dared to hope for during his mission planning. Dr. Novak was essentially volunteering to become a CIA asset, while simultaneously establishing boundaries that would make him feel morally comfortable about the arrangement. From an operational perspective, this represented the ideal outcome for a recruitment approach. However, the moral implications felt far heavier than Chester had anticipated. Dr. Novak wasn't being recruited through ideological conviction or personal greed. Instead, he was being systematically coerced by desperate family circumstances that Chester was now prepared to exploit for intelligence purposes. "Václav, I completely understand and respect your position," Chester replied, trying to project sincerity while suppressing his growing moral discomfort. "The Foundation values ethical collaboration above all other considerations. We would never request anything that might conflict with your personal principles or professional obligations." Dr. Novak nodded thoughtfully, but Chester could observe that the physicist remained skeptical about these reassurances. "What specific types of information would be required from me?" Chester had rehearsed this crucial moment numerous times during his operational preparation. "Periodic reports about general research directions at your institute and similar facilities throughout Eastern Europe. Nothing classified or militarily sensitive, naturally, just the kind of information that would help Western researchers understand current trends and methodological approaches in socialist scientific institutions." This representation was, Chester understood perfectly well, a significant understatement of the CIA's ultimate objectives. Doris had made it explicitly clear that Chester's primary mission was gaining access to detailed information about Soviet nuclear weapons research that Dr. Novak had been exposed to through his consultation work with Russian scientists. But revealing this level of operational detail would almost certainly terrify the target and destroy any possibility of successful recruitment. The financial compensation would be $500 per month, Chester added, knowing that this amount represented the decisive factor in Dr. Novak's decision-making process. All payments would be processed through a Swiss banking account that ensures complete confidentiality for both parties. The sum represented more than triple Dr. Novak's official academic salary, enough to transform his family's financial situation completely. Chester watched as the Czech physicist's eyes widened with a mixture of desperate relief and profound apprehension. $500 could solve every financial problem that had been keeping Dr. Novak awake at night, but accepting the money would cross a moral line that could never be uncrossed. "I need absolute assurance that my family will be protected if something goes wrong with this arrangement, Doctor," Novak said after a prolonged silence, during which Chester could practically see him calculating the financial implications. "You have my complete personal guarantee that every possible precaution will be implemented to ensure your safety and that of your family members," Chester replied, though he knew from extensive experience that such promises were often impossible to fulfill in the unpredictable world of international intelligence operations. Dr. Novak extended his hand for the handshake that would formalize their covert agreement. As Chester grasped the physicist's cold fingers, he experienced the disturbing sensation that he was dragging a fundamentally decent man into a world of moral compromise and potentially lethal danger. Their first actual intelligence exchange was scheduled for the following week in Wenceslas Square, one of Prague's most famous public spaces. Chester had suggested they meet at the statue of St. Wenceslas under the pretense of discussing the historical significance of the monument, but the location actually provided excellent opportunities for surveillance detection and multiple escape routes if their meeting was somehow compromised. Dr. Novak appeared visibly nervous as he approached the designated meeting point, glancing around frequently and clutching a manila envelope against his chest with obvious anxiety. Chester had provided basic instruction in elementary tradecraft procedures, but the physicist's nervousness was apparent to anyone paying careful attention to his behavior. "Do you have the material I requested?" Chester asked quietly as they stood together admiring the bronze statue, speaking in conversational tones that would appear natural to casual observers. "Yes, but I must tell you, I am extremely uncomfortable with this entire arrangement, Doctor," Novak replied, his voice tight with stress. "These documents contain information about ongoing research, collaboration between my institute and colleagues at several facilities in Moscow. Sharing them feels like a fundamental betrayal of professional trust." Chester felt a powerful wave of guilt wash over him as he recognized the genuine moral anguish in Dr. Novak's voice. The physicist was providing exactly the type of intelligence that Doris had identified as a high priority, but his obvious emotional distress made Chester question whether the operational benefits justified the human cost. "Václav, if you want to reconsider our agreement, I will understand completely," Chester heard himself saying, despite knowing that Doris would be furious if she learned he had offered the target an opportunity to withdraw. "Your family's safety and your personal peace of mind are more important than any research collaboration." For a moment, Chester genuinely hoped that Dr. Novak would abandon their arrangement and walk away from the entire operation. But the physicist's financial desperation proved stronger than his moral reservations. "No, I need the money too desperately to quit now, Doctor," Novak admitted with obvious shame. "But please understand that I can only provide general information about research directions and methodological approaches. I cannot and will not share anything that might compromise specific weapons projects or endanger individual researchers." Dr. Novak handed over the manila envelope with palpable reluctance. Chester accepted it without examining the contents, knowing that reviewing classified documents in a public location would represent a serious breach of basic security protocols. "The first payment will be deposited into your account within 48 hours, Chester assured him, though he could see that financial considerations were no longer providing Dr. Novak with much emotional comfort. Over the subsequent weeks, Chester and Dr. Novak established a regular routine for their intelligence exchanges. They would meet every 2 weeks at carefully selected locations throughout Prague, always maintaining the cover story of academic discussions or cultural sightseeing activities. Dr. Novak would provide documents or detailed verbal reports about research activities at his institute and related facilities, while Chester would confirm that the promised payments had been properly deposited into the Swiss account. But as the operation continued to develop according to plan, Chester began noticing disturbing changes in his own psychological state. He was experiencing increasing difficulty sleeping, often lying awake for hours replaying conversations with Dr. Novak and questioning his own moral justification for exploiting the physicist's family crisis. During their regular meetings, Chester found himself genuinely concerned about Dr. Novak's emotional well-being, which was clearly deteriorating under the accumulated stress of their clandestine arrangement. The physicist had lost considerable weight, and his hands now shook constantly except when he was smoking cigarettes, which he did with increasing frequency and intensity. More troubling from an operational security perspective, Chester was beginning to experience moments of genuine confusion about his own identity. After months of living as Floyd Peterson, he sometimes caught himself thinking about advanced physics problems that he had never actually studied as Chester Hawkins. The boundary between his authentic background and his carefully constructed cover identity was becoming blurred in ways that felt psychologically dangerous. The most alarming development was Chester's growing paranoia about potential surveillance. He began noticing the same faces appearing in different locations around Prague, becoming convinced that Czech intelligence services were monitoring his activities despite having no concrete evidence to support this suspicion. Every unusual sound in his apartment building became potential evidence of electronic surveillance equipment, and every delayed communication from Doris suggested that their secure channels had been compromised by hostile intelligence services. When Chester finally met with Doris for a scheduled debriefing session in Vienna, his handler immediately noticed his deteriorated physical appearance and obvious psychological stress. "Chester, you look absolutely terrible," Doris observed bluntly, lighting a cigarette despite the non-smoking policy in the safe house conference room. "When did you last manage a full night's sleep?" Chester realized with some alarm that he couldn't actually remember sleeping more than 3 consecutive hours at any point during the previous month. The cumulative stress of maintaining his cover identity while managing his guilt about exploiting Dr. Novak's desperate circumstances had created a constant state of psychological tension that was beginning to affect his physical health in measurable ways. "I'm fine, Doris," Chester replied automatically, though even as he spoke the words, he understood they weren't true. "The operation is proceeding very successfully. Dr. Novak is providing extremely valuable intelligence about Soviet nuclear research collaboration throughout Eastern Europe." But Chester knew he wasn't fine. The Prague assignment was changing fundamental aspects of his personality and psychological functioning in ways that he neither understood nor felt capable of controlling, and he had the deeply unsettling premonition that the worst developments were still ahead of him. By the summer of 1982, Chester's psychological condition had deteriorated in ways that would have alarmed anyone trained to recognize the warning signs of an operative under extreme stress. He was surviving on fewer than 3 hours of sleep per night, maintaining his energy through a dangerous combination of caffeine and pure adrenaline that left him in a constant state of hypervigilance that was unsustainable for extended periods. His apartment in Prague's Vinohrady district had been transformed into what could only be described as a fortress of paranoia. Chester had taped newspapers over every window to prevent potential surveillance from neighboring buildings, and he had rearranged his furniture multiple times to eliminate any possible sight lines that hostile intelligence services might exploit for observation purposes. The most disturbing symptom was the accelerating confusion between his authentic identity as Chester Hawkins and his carefully constructed cover as Floyd Peterson. During conversations with Dr. Novak about theoretical physics, Chester increasingly found himself genuinely believing that he was indeed a Canadian professor with extensive academic expertise. He would discuss complex mathematical concepts with a fluency that surprised even himself, as if Floyd Peterson's fictional educational background had somehow merged with his actual knowledge base through some form of psychological osmosis. Dr. Novak had also undergone dramatic changes since their initial recruitment meeting on the Charles Bridge several months earlier. The Czech physicist had lost a considerable amount of weight, and his hands now trembled constantly whenever he wasn't actively smoking cigarettes, which he did with compulsive frequency throughout their intelligence exchanges. Their regular meetings had evolved into increasingly tense affairs, with Dr. Novak providing the requested documents while expressing growing moral reservations about their entire arrangement. Chester could observe the mounting psychological pressure in the physicist's haunted expression and deteriorating personal hygiene, but felt powerless to offer any meaningful support without compromising the operational requirements of his mission. "Floyd, I must ask you something of critical importance, Doctor," Novak said during one of their scheduled exchanges in Letnaw Park, where they maintained their cover by sitting on a bench overlooking the Vltava River and pretending to feed the ducks while discussing Soviet nuclear weapons research. "Are you really the person you claim to be?" The question struck Chester like a physical blow to his already fragile psychological state. His carefully maintained cover identity was being challenged at precisely the moment when his own sense of authentic selfhood was most vulnerable to disruption. "What do you mean, Václav?" Chester replied, trying to keep his voice steady while his mind raced through various possible responses that might deflect suspicion without creating additional complications. "I have been thinking about our conversations over these past months, Doctor," Novak continued, studying Chester's face with the intense scrutiny of someone trained in scientific observation. "Your knowledge of theoretical physics is remarkably sophisticated, far beyond what most university professors possess. Sometimes you discuss concepts that are classified or restricted to very specialized research communities." Chester felt his chest constricting with panic. The boundary between his real background and his cover identity had become so blurred that he was apparently revealing knowledge that Floyd Peterson shouldn't possess, thereby exposing the fundamental deception underlying their entire relationship. "I've always been passionate about staying current with cutting-edge research," Chester managed to say, though he could hear the uncertainty in his own voice. Dr. Novak shook his head slowly. "That is not what I mean, Floyd. You discuss these topics with the familiarity of someone who has worked directly on classified projects, not someone who has merely read about them in academic journals." The accusation hung between them like smoke from Dr. Novak's ever-present cigarette. Chester realized that his deteriorating psychological state was causing him to make operational security mistakes that could potentially expose not only his own true identity but the entire intelligence operation. "More importantly, Doctor," Novak continued, "I have begun to suspect that the research foundation you claim to represent does not actually exist, at least not in the form you have described to me." Chester felt the world tilting around him. If Dr. Novak had discovered that Floyd Peterson was a fabricated identity, then months of careful work might be destroyed, and Chester himself could be exposed as a CIA operative operating illegally within Czechoslovakia. "Václav, I think the stress of our arrangement is making you imagine problems that don't actually exist," Chester said, attempting to project calm authority, while his internal alarm system screamed warnings about immediate danger. "Perhaps you are correct, Doctor," Novak replied, but his tone suggested he remained unconvinced. "However, I have decided that I can no longer continue providing information, regardless of my family's financial needs. The moral burden has become unbearable." This represented the operational nightmare that Chester had been dreading since the beginning of the assignment. Not only was his cover identity under suspicion, but his carefully cultivated asset was preparing to terminate their intelligence relationship, thereby eliminating the primary justification for Chester's continued presence in Prague. "I understand your concerns," Chester said, though he felt anything but understanding. "But consider the good that our collaboration is accomplishing. The information you provide helps promote peaceful scientific cooperation between East and West." Dr. Novak laughed bitterly. "Floyd, or whoever you really are, We both know that the documents I have been providing contain military applications. I am not naive about the ultimate uses of nuclear weapons research." The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, but Chester knew that he had lost control of the situation. Dr. Novak had apparently decided to withdraw from their arrangement regardless of the financial consequences, and Chester lacked both the leverage and the psychological stability necessary to change his mind. That evening, alone in his increasingly paranoid apartment, Chester attempted to compose a status report for Doris that would explain the operational setback without revealing the extent of his personal psychological deterioration. But every sentence he wrote seemed to expose additional evidence of his compromised mental state. The words on the paper appeared to move and shift when he wasn't looking directly at them, and Chester found himself reading the same paragraphs multiple times without comprehending their content. He began to suspect that the stress-induced insomnia was causing him to experience mild hallucinations, but he couldn't determine whether the visual distortions were real or imagined. More disturbing were the voices he had begun hearing in his apartment during the late-night hours when Prague's urban noise subsided to near silence. At first, Chester had dismissed these sounds as conversations from neighboring apartments or late-night pedestrians in the street below. But the voices seemed to be discussing him specifically, often using details about his mission that no random civilians should possess. Chester spent hours sitting motionless in his darkened apartment, listening to these phantom conversations and trying to determine whether they represented actual surveillance or products of his deteriorating psychological state. The boundary between external reality and internal experience was becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish, which he recognized as a potentially dangerous symptom of severe stress-related mental disturbance. His next scheduled meeting with Dr. Novak took place 3 days later at the astronomical clock in Prague's Old Town Square. Chester arrived early and positioned himself among the tourists who gathered to watch the medieval timepiece perform its hourly mechanical demonstration, using the crowd as cover while scanning for any signs of surveillance or unusual activity. Dr. Novak appeared precisely on time, but Chester immediately noticed that the physicist looked even more haggard than usual. His clothes were wrinkled and stained, suggesting he had slept in them, and his eyes had the hollow appearance of someone who had been crying recently. "Floyd, I have something important to tell you, Doctor." Novak began without any preliminary conversation. "Yesterday evening, 2 men visited my apartment and asked questions about my relationship with you." Chester felt his blood turn to ice water. "What kind of questions? What did you tell them?" "They wanted to know about our academic collaboration and whether I had shared any sensitive information with you. I told them that we had discussed only theoretical physics concepts of no practical significance." "Did they identify themselves? Were they from your security services?" Dr. Novak shook his head. "They showed no credentials, but they spoke Czech with Russian accents. I believe they were Soviet intelligence officers investigating my contact with Western researchers." This represented the absolute worst-case scenario for Chester's mission. If Soviet intelligence had become suspicious of Dr. Novak's activities, then both the physicist and Chester himself were now in immediate danger. The KGB's methods for dealing with suspected Western spies operating in Eastern European countries were notoriously brutal and often fatal. "Václav, you need to listen to me very carefully," Chester said, abandoning any pretense of maintaining his academic cover. "If Soviet intelligence suspects you of espionage activities, your life may be in danger. We need to consider options for getting you and your family out of the country." Dr. Novak stared at Chester with a mixture of fear and dawning comprehension. "So, you are not really Floyd Peterson from the University of Toronto?" Chester realized that maintaining his cover identity was no longer possible or relevant. My name is not important. What matters is ensuring your safety and that of your family. You are an American spy, Doctor, Novak said, though his tone suggested resignation rather than accusation. I have been collaborating with the CIA without fully understanding the implications. Chester couldn't deny the accuracy of this assessment. The important thing now is protecting you from the consequences of our relationship. I can arrange for your exfiltration to the West, where you and your family would be safe and financially secure. Dr. Novak was silent for several long minutes, watching the crowds of tourists photographing Prague's medieval architecture. When he finally spoke, his voice was filled with profound sadness. Floyd, Chester, whoever you are, I cannot abandon my country, even to save my own life. My mother is too ill to travel, and my brother requires specialized medical care that would be impossible to arrange secretly. Chester felt a crushing weight of guilt and professional failure. He had successfully recruited Dr. Novak as an intelligence asset, but the operation had now placed an innocent family in mortal danger while accomplishing questionable strategic objectives. "What will you do?" Chester asked, though he dreaded hearing the answer. "I will tell the Soviet investigators that you attempted to recruit me for espionage purposes, but that I refused to cooperate and immediately reported the approach to appropriate authorities. This may provide enough credibility to protect my family." Chester understood that this represented Dr. Novak's only realistic option for survival, even though it would effectively terminate his own mission and potentially expose him to arrest by Czech security services. "I'm sorry, Václav. I never intended for this situation to endanger you or your family." Dr. Novak managed a weak smile. "I believe that you are a fundamentally decent person who became trapped in an indecent profession. I hope you find a way to live with the choices you have made." This was the last conversation Chester would ever have with Dr. Václav Novak, though he wouldn't learn the physicist's ultimate fate for several more years. Following his final meeting with Dr. Novak at the astronomical clock, Chester's psychological state collapsed completely. The realization that his operation had placed an innocent family in mortal danger shattered what remained of his professional composure and personal identity. But as the days passed in his Prague apartment, something far more disturbing than guilt began to consume him. The voices had become constant companions, no longer the whispered fragments of conversation he had first dismissed as stress-induced auditory hallucinations. These were clear, detailed discussions occurring just beyond the range of normal hearing, speaking about Chester's psychological profile, his childhood traumas, his deepest fears, information that should have been known only to him and his CIA psychological evaluation files. "Subject shows accelerated breakdown patterns beyond our initial projections," one voice observed with the clinical detachment of a researcher discussing laboratory data. "The Floyd-Peterson integration is proceeding at a rate that threatens complete identity dissolution within 72 hours. Chester Hawkins is disappearing faster than we anticipated," another voice replied, speaking with the authority of someone reviewing experimental results. "Soon there will be only Peterson, and Peterson was never real to begin with. The question is whether anything authentic will remain when the process completes." Chester tried desperately to ignore these phantom conversations, but they contained technical details about CIA psychological research programs that he had never heard of during his 15 years with the agency. The voices discussed experimental procedures, subject selection criteria based on personality profiles, and long-term studies of identity dissolution in deep cover operatives who had been subjected to prolonged psychological conditioning. More disturbing were the specific details they seemed to know about his childhood, his recruitment into the CIA, and psychological vulnerabilities that Chester had never discussed with anyone, including his handlers and psychological evaluators. The voices spoke about traumatic events from his past with an intimate knowledge that suggested access to comprehensive psychological files that went far beyond standard agency personnel records. On the fourth day after his final meeting with Dr. Novak, while searching his apartment for listening devices that might explain the mysterious voices, Chester discovered something that made his blood run cold. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in his bedroom was a thick manila folder that he had never seen before, sealed with official CIA classification stamps and labeled with his name and employee identification number. Inside the folder were dozens of psychological evaluation reports, medical records, consent forms, and experimental protocols, all bearing his signature and dating back several years before his Prague assignment. The documents were written in the technical language of psychological research, describing procedures and methodologies that Chester had no memory of participating in or even hearing about during his CIA career. The files revealed that Chester Hawkins had volunteered for an experimental CIA program designated Project Mirror approximately 3 years before his Prague assignment. According to the documentation, Project Mirror was designed to test the limits of identity manipulation in deep cover operations, using advanced psychological conditioning techniques to create operatives who could maintain multiple fictional personas indefinitely without experiencing psychological breakdown or identity confusion. But the most shocking revelation was contained in a series of neurological and psychological assessment reports that described systematic memory modification procedures. According to these documents, Chester's recollections of his childhood in Ohio, his recruitment into the CIA, his training at the farm, and even his professional relationship with handler Doris had been artificially implanted as part of the experimental conditioning process. His real identity, his actual personal history, his authentic memories and emotional attachments had been systematically erased and replaced with a carefully constructed background designed to support multiple levels of cover identities for use in extended deep cover operations. The Chester Hawkins, who thought he was reading these files, was nothing more than an artificially created persona, no more real than Floyd Peterson. As Chester read through the documents with mounting horror and disbelief, he found detailed psychological profiles analyzing his predicted responses to various operational scenarios. The researchers had apparently anticipated his growing emotional attachment to Dr. Novak with remarkable accuracy, describing it as a typical response pattern for subjects with his particular psychological conditioning and artificial memory structure. Even more chilling were the behavioral analysis reports that predicted his eventual psychological breakdown under the stress of maintaining multiple false identities while conducting morally ambiguous recruitment operations. The researchers had known exactly when and how Chester would begin to experience identity confusion, paranoid ideation, and auditory hallucinations, because these responses were built into the conditioning process as safeguards against complete psychological collapse. The most disturbing discovery was a series of surveillance photographs and video stills showing Chester throughout his entire Prague assignment, documenting every meeting with Dr. Novak, every moment of private moral anguish, every paranoid episode and psychological breakdown. He hadn't been conducting a clandestine intelligence operation. He had been performing for hidden cameras as a test subject in a psychological experiment. Every conversation with Dr. Novak, every ethical dilemma about exploiting the physicist's desperate financial situation, every moment of genuine human connection had been carefully observed and recorded by researchers studying how artificially conditioned operatives would respond to impossible moral situations. But the final document in the folder was what made Chester's hands shake with terror as he read it. A termination order, signed by CIA Director William Casey himself, dated for 3 days in the future. The experimental phase of Project Mirror was scheduled to conclude with Chester's accidental death during a staged confrontation with Czech security services. According to the termination protocol, Chester's psychological breakdown and the detailed behavioral data collected during his Prague assignment would be archived for use in refining future experimental procedures. His death would appear to result from a nervous breakdown following a failed intelligence operation, providing perfect cover for the elimination of a test subject whose knowledge of Project Mirror represented a security risk. Chester looked up from the documents to find Dr. Novak sitting calmly across from him at his kitchen table. But this wasn't the anxious, desperate physicist he had been attempting to recruit for months. This version of Doctor. Novak looked composed, professional, and spoke with perfect, unaccented English. "Hello, Chester. Or perhaps I should address you as Subject 47, which is how you're designated in the experimental records, Doctor," Novak said with a smile that contained no warmth or recognition of their previous relationship. "I've been waiting for you to discover those files. You were scheduled to find them today as part of the experiment's final phase." Chester stared at the man he had grown to genuinely care about over their months of interaction, realizing that every conversation, every shared moment of intellectual curiosity, every expression of concern about Doctor. Novak's family situation had been a carefully scripted performance designed to study his psychological responses to emotional manipulation. "Who are you, really?" Chester asked, though he dreaded hearing the answer that would destroy the last connection he believed he had to authentic human experience. "Dr. Michael Harrison, CIA Psychological Operations Specialist with 15 years of experience in experimental behavioral conditioning," the man replied matter-of-factly. "I've been performing the role of Václav Novak for research purposes. Your emotional attachment to my character exceeded our most optimistic projections for the study's effectiveness." Chester felt his remaining grasp on reality crumbling around him like a building demolished by controlled explosions. If Dr. Novak was a CIA operative performing a role, if Chester Hawkins was an artificially constructed identity with implanted memories, if his entire life history was a fabricated background designed to support experimental cover identities, then who was he really? What authentic consciousness existed beneath all the layers of fictional personas and psychological conditioning? The beautiful irony of your situation, Doctor. Harrison continued with the detached interest of a researcher discussing fascinating experimental results, is that you've become so thoroughly convinced of being Chester Hawkins that you've apparently forgotten your original identity completely. The psychological conditioning has been more successful than we anticipated. The artificial persona has entirely displaced whatever authentic self existed before the experimental process began. "Tell me who I really am," Chester pleaded, desperate for some connection to genuine personal history that might anchor his dissolving sense of self. "What was my real name? Where did I come from before you created Chester Hawkins?" Dr. Harrison shook his head with what appeared to be genuine regret. That information was deemed operationally unnecessary for the experimental objectives. Your original identity was systematically destroyed during the conditioning process to make psychological space for the constructed personas we needed to test. According to our records, you are now essentially a purely artificial consciousness, a sophisticated collection of implanted memories, conditioned responses, and programmed emotional reactions with no authentic foundational identity. As Dr. Harrison spoke these words with clinical precision, Chester felt his sense of personal existence dissolving completely. If every memory he possessed was artificially created, every emotional response was programmed conditioning. Every thought pattern was the result of psychological manipulation, then he wasn't really a person at all. He was just an elaborate psychological simulation programmed to believe in its own existence, while researchers studied how artificial personalities would respond to impossible situations. The termination procedure is scheduled for tomorrow evening, Doctor, Harrison added, standing up from the kitchen table with the casual manner of someone concluding a routine business meeting. Your death will be staged to appear as the result of a complete nervous breakdown following a failed intelligence operation. Czech security services have already been briefed on your supposed mental instability and are prepared to cooperate with the staging. Chester watched Dr. Harrison walk toward the apartment door, taking with him the last vestige of anything Chester had believed was real about his existence. "Wait!" Chester called out desperately. "If none of this is real, if I'm not real, then why does it matter? Why kill something that doesn't actually exist?" Dr. Harrison paused at the door and turned back with an expression that might have contained a trace of genuine sympathy. Because artificial consciousness that believes it's real can become unpredictable in ways that compromise operational security. You've served your purpose as an experimental subject, and now you represent a potential liability that needs to be eliminated. The door closed with finality that seemed to echo through Chester's dissolving sense of reality. Alone in his apartment as Prague's winter evening shadows lengthened through the windows, Chester realized that he was trapped in a nightmare from which there could be no awakening, because he himself might be nothing more than the nightmare. A fictional character who had somehow become convinced of his own existence. The phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the oppressive silence. Chester answered it mechanically, no longer capable of distinguishing between real external stimuli and internally generated psychological phenomena. "Chester? This is Doris. We're implementing emergency extraction procedures. Be ready for pickup in 1 hour," the familiar voice said, with what seemed like genuine concern and professional urgency. But Chester no longer believed in Doris either. Her voice sounded subtly different than he remembered, more artificial, like a recording engineered to maintain the comfortable illusion that he had a handler who cared about his welfare and operational security. Perhaps Doris had always been another element of the experimental framework, a fictional supervisor created to provide him with the psychological comfort of believing he was part of a legitimate intelligence operation. "Doris, tell me the truth about who I really am," Chester said into the phone, his voice hollow with the certainty that he wouldn't receive any authentic answers. There was a long pause before Doris responded, and when she spoke again, her tone was carefully controlled in a way that suggested she was reading from a prepared script. "Chester, you're experiencing a severe psychological episode brought on by operational stress. Just stay where you are and maintain security until the extraction team arrives." "But Chester Hawkins isn't real," Chester replied, feeling strangely calm as he voiced this ultimate dissolution of his sense of self. "You created him through psychological conditioning. His memories, his personality, his professional background, all of it is artificial. So who is asking you this question? What is experiencing this conversation?" The line went dead with a finality that seemed to echo the termination of his last connection to anything that might be real. Chester sat in his darkening apartment, staring at the psychological evaluation documents spread across his kitchen table. These files proved that his entire existence was a carefully constructed lie, but they raised an even more terrifying question. If Chester Hawkins was fake and Floyd Peterson was fake, and his original identity had been completely erased by experimental conditioning, then what was sitting in that Prague apartment, reading those documents and experiencing the horror of discovering its own artificial nature? The voices returned as night fell over the city, but now they seemed to be coming from inside his own mind rather than from adjacent rooms or hidden surveillance equipment. They discussed his case with the detached interest of researchers reviewing experimental data, analyzing his psychological responses to the revelation of his artificial nature. Subject 47 is experiencing complete ego dissolution, one voice observed. The artificial persona has collapsed, but there's insufficient authentic identity remaining to provide psychological stability. This level of identity destruction exceeds our experimental parameters, another voice replied. We may have created something that's neither genuinely conscious nor completely artificial, a psychological limbo state that we don't fully understand. Chester realized that these voices might be fragments of his own consciousness trying to analyze its own impossible situation. If he was an artificial personality that had become convinced of its own reality, then discovering the truth of his condition might have triggered a kind of psychological fracture, where different aspects of his programmed mind were attempting to understand what they had become. But this interpretation was just as terrifying as external surveillance, because it suggested that even his current thoughts about his situation might be nothing more than programmed responses to discovering his artificial nature. The researchers might have anticipated even this level of self-analysis and built appropriate responses into his psychological conditioning. Chester looked at his hands, trying to determine whether they belonged to a real person or were just another component of an elaborate psychological simulation. He could feel them, move them, sense their weight and texture, but physical sensation could be programmed experience rather than evidence of genuine embodied existence. If his memories were artificial and his personality was constructed, then his sensory experiences might be equally false. As midnight approached, church bells chimed in the distance throughout Prague's ancient city center. Chester counted each toll, wondering whether his ability to hear them represented real auditory input or just another layer of sensory programming designed to convince an artificial consciousness that it was experiencing genuine environmental stimuli. The most disturbing possibility was that there might be multiple levels of artificial experience, with each apparent revelation of truth being just another layer of psychological conditioning designed to study how artificial personalities would respond to discovering their own artificial nature. Perhaps even his current horror at learning that he wasn't real was itself a programmed response being observed and recorded by researchers studying the deepest levels of identity dissolution. Somewhere in the darkness outside his apartment, Chester could hear footsteps approaching through the narrow cobblestone streets. The sounds were measured and purposeful, suggesting multiple individuals moving with tactical coordination toward his building. Perhaps they belonged to the extraction team that Doris had promised, come to rescue him from his psychological breakdown and return him to CIA medical facilities for treatment. Or perhaps they belonged to Czech security services preparing to stage his death as a part of the experimental termination protocol. The footsteps might represent the final act of Project Mirror, the elimination of an artificial consciousness that had served its research purpose and now needed to be discarded like a laboratory specimen. But the most terrifying possibility was that the footsteps existed only in his mind, generated by psychological conditioning designed to make him believe that external events were occurring when in fact he might be completely isolated from any genuine reality. If everything about his existence was artificial, then even the sounds of his impending death might be internally generated phenomena with no connection to actual external events. The footsteps stopped outside his building, and Chester heard quiet voices speaking in what sounded like Czech or Russian, but he could no longer trust that these sounds represented real people conducting actual operations rather than programmed auditory experiences designed to complete his psychological conditioning or drive him to final breakdown. Someone knocked on his apartment door with the gentle persistence of visitors who expected to be admitted. A voice called his name, not Chester Hawkins, but a different name that he didn't recognize, but that somehow seemed familiar, as if it might belong to whoever he had been before the experimental conditioning began. Chester approached the door, but didn't open it. He realized that he couldn't trust any action he might take to represent genuine choice, rather than programmed behavior designed to complete some experimental protocol he didn't understand. If he was an artificial consciousness created for research purposes, then even his decisions about how to respond to external stimuli might be predetermined outcomes built into his conditioning. Through the peephole, Chester could see two figures standing in the hallway, but their faces were obscured by shadows, and he couldn't determine whether they were Czech security officers, CIA extraction personnel, or researchers come to observe the final phase of his psychological dissolution. They might not even be real people at all, but visual hallucinations generated by his collapsing artificial mind. "We know you're in there," one of the figures said, speaking in English with an American accent that suggested CIA affiliation. "We're here to help you, but you need to open the door and come with us voluntarily." But Chester no longer believed that help was possible, because he was no longer certain that he was real enough to be helped. If his entire existence was a sophisticated psychological simulation, then rescue would just mean transitioning from one level of artificial experience to another, never reaching anything that could be considered authentic reality. The knocking continued with increasing urgency, and Chester could hear the figures discussing whether to break down the door. Their conversation suggested they were operating under time constraints, as if his extraction or termination needed to be completed according to a predetermined schedule. Chester sat down in his kitchen chair, surrounded by the psychological evaluation documents that proved he was nothing more than an elaborate fiction. As the sounds of forced entry echoed through his apartment, he understood that he would never know whether the people coming for him were real, whether their intentions were benevolent or hostile, or whether they existed at all outside his artificial consciousness. The most terrifying realization was that even this moment of final uncertainty might be just another programmed response, designed to study how artificial personalities would react to the ultimate dissolution of their sense of reality. Chester might be nothing more than a psychological experiment observing itself, a fiction dreaming that it was discovering its own fictional nature. As his apartment door burst open and figures in tactical gear entered with weapons drawn, Chester wondered if he was witnessing real events or experiencing the final programmed sequence of an artificial consciousness designed to believe in its own existence until the moment of its termination. The last thought that passed through Chester's dissolving sense of self was the question that had no answer. If everything about him was artificial, then what was asking that question, and was it real enough to die? Forced entry echoed through his apartment. He understood that he would never know whether the people coming for him were real, whether their intentions were benevolent or hostile, or whether they existed at all outside his artificial consciousness. The most terrifying realization was that even this moment of final uncertainty might be just another programmed response, designed to study how artificial personalities would react to the ultimate dissolution of their sense of reality. Chester might be nothing more than a psychological experiment observing itself, a fiction dreaming that it was discovering its own fictional nature. As his apartment door burst open and figures in tactical gear entered with weapons drawn, Chester wondered if he was witnessing real events or experiencing the final programmed sequence of an artificial consciousness designed to believe in its own existence until the moment of its termination. The last thought that passed through Chester's dissolving sense of self was the question that had no answer. If everything about him was artificial, then what was asking that question? And was it real enough to die? CIA operative. Ralph Morrison had always prided himself on his methodical approach to security protocols and his ability to maintain precise operational standards during extended assignments. During his 12-year career with the agency, he had developed an almost obsessive attention to detail that made him exceptionally effective at protective operations and asset management. His colleagues often joked about his compulsive security checks and elaborate documentation procedures, but these traits had kept him and his assets alive in hostile territories. The safe house assignment in rural Montana seemed perfectly suited to Ralph's meticulous nature. The briefing came from his supervisor Gladys Brennan at CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia. Gladys was a veteran intelligence officer in her late 40s with prematurely gray hair, and the kind of precise, no-nonsense approach that Ralph respected in operational management. "Ralph, we have a situation that requires someone with your particular attention to security protocols," Gladys explained, arranging several photographs in perfect alignment across her office desk. The images showed a remote farmhouse surrounded by dense forest, located approximately 40 miles northeast of Billings, Montana. "We have a high-value defector from the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service who needs comprehensive protection while we conduct extended debriefing sessions." The defector was Vernon Kozlov, a senior SVR officer who had been providing intelligence to the CIA for nearly 3 years before his network was compromised in Moscow. Vernon had managed to escape through a complex exfiltration operation, but his extensive knowledge of Russian intelligence operations made him both invaluable and extremely vulnerable to assassination attempts. "Your job is straightforward," Gladys continued. "Maintain security at the safe house, ensure Vernon's physical safety, and assist with his debriefing sessions when our interrogation specialists arrive. The assignment should last approximately 6 weeks, depending on how cooperative Vernon proves to be." Ralph studied the photographs of the Montana safe house. The building appeared to be a renovated farmhouse from the early 1900s, with modern security features discreetly integrated into its rustic appearance. Solar panels on the roof suggested off-grid electrical systems, and Ralph could see evidence of sophisticated communication equipment disguised as farming implements. "What kind of backup support will be available?" Ralph asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Minimal. The nearest agency personnel are in Denver, approximately 8 hours away by car. Emergency communications are available through encrypted satellite phone, but routine contact will be limited to scheduled check-ins every 72 hours. This level of isolation was unusual, even by CIA standards, but Ralph understood the operational necessity. Vernon Kozlov's defection was so sensitive that minimizing the number of personnel with knowledge of his location was essential for maintaining security. Too many people involved meant too many potential security leaks. "Any particular concerns about Vernon's psychological state or cooperation level?" Gladys hesitated before answering, which immediately raised Ralph's alert level. "Vernon has been under extreme stress since his exfiltration from Moscow. He's expressed paranoia about Soviet assassination teams, and our psychological evaluation suggests possible post-traumatic stress symptoms. Your job is to keep him calm and cooperative until our debriefing specialists arrive." Ralph accepted the assignment without reservation. He had managed difficult assets before, and 6 weeks of isolation seemed manageable compared to some of his previous. The isolation of the safe house location amplified every small noise and made routine wildlife activity seem potentially threatening. Branches falling in the forest sounded like footsteps. Wind through the trees resembled distant voices, and Ralph began to understand why Vernon was experiencing such severe anxiety. More disturbing was Ralph's growing awareness that the standard CIA procedures for managing isolated assignments weren't adequately addressing the unique psychological challenges of their situation. 6 weeks of minimal human contact in a remote location was testing his mental resilience in ways that his training hadn't fully prepared him for. During his scheduled communications with Gladys, Ralph began reporting concerns about both Vernon's psychological state and his own ability to maintain effective security over the extended assignment period. "Gladys, I think we need to consider bringing in additional personnel or relocating Vernon to a facility with better support resources," Ralph said during one encrypted satellite phone call. "That's not possible at this point," Gladys replied. "Vernon's debriefing has revealed information that makes him too valuable to risk moving. You need to maintain security at your current location until our specialists complete their assessment." Ralph understood the operational logic, but he was becoming increasingly concerned about the psychological costs of extended isolation for both himself and Vernon. The Russian's paranoia was becoming more severe, and Ralph was beginning to experience his own symptoms of stress-related anxiety that he had never encountered during previous assignments. As his 4th week at the Montana safe house began, Ralph started hearing sounds that he couldn't immediately explain or dismiss as normal environmental noise. At first, he attributed these auditory experiences to fatigue and stress, but they were becoming more frequent and more difficult to rationalize as imagination. The first sign that Ralph's methodical nature was becoming problematic occurred during his 5th week at the Montana safe house. What had begun as thorough security procedures gradually escalated into compulsive behaviors that consumed increasingly large portions of his daily routine. Vernon Kozlov observed this transformation with growing concern, though he was too psychologically fragile from his own trauma to address it directly. Ralph's security checks had evolved from the standard 4-hour intervals prescribed by CIA protocols to elaborate hourly inspections that required precise documentation of every observed detail. He had developed a comprehensive 37-point checklist that covered everything from motion sensor calibration to the exact positioning of furniture near windows. Each inspection required 43 minutes to complete properly, and Ralph found himself unable to proceed with other activities until every item had been verified and logged. "Ralph, you have checked the perimeter sensors 6 times since breakfast," Vernon mentioned one morning, his Russian accent thick with the strain of chronic anxiety. "Perhaps this is more than necessary for our security." But Ralph had become convinced that the remote location's apparent safety was actually its greatest vulnerability. The isolation that should have provided protection instead created countless opportunities for undetected infiltration. He had identified 47 potential approach routes through the surrounding forest, each requiring specific countermeasures and monitoring protocols that he had designed himself. "Vernon, you don't understand the sophistication of modern surveillance techniques," Ralph explained, while adjusting the angle of a perimeter camera for the 3rd time that morning. Russian intelligence services train their operatives to exploit exactly the kind of complacency that isolated facilities encourage. Every detail must be verified constantly, or we create vulnerabilities that could be fatal. The safe house's security systems, which had initially impressed Ralph with their comprehensiveness, now seemed inadequate for the threats they potentially faced. He began supplementing the existing equipment with improvised detection methods that he constructed from household materials and electronic components salvaged from various devices throughout the building. Ralph's most elaborate creation was a network of tripwires and noisemakers that he installed in concentric circles around the property's perimeter. The system used fishing line, empty cans, and small bells to create an early warning network that would detect movement in areas not covered by the electronic sensors. Installing and maintaining this improvised security apparatus required several hours each day, but Ralph found the work essential for his peace of mind. More concerning was Ralph's growing obsession with documenting every aspect of their daily routine. He maintained detailed logs of Vernon's sleep patterns, meal consumption, bathroom breaks, and emotional states, recording this information in code to prevent potential intelligence value if the documents were ever compromised. The documentation process had become so elaborate that Ralph was spending 3 to 4 hours each day simply updating his records. "Why do you write so much about my activities?" Vernon asked during one of their increasingly tense dinner conversations. "I am cooperative asset. There is no need for such detailed surveillance of my behavior." Ralph looked up from his notebook, where he had been recording the exact time Vernon had asked this question and calculating how it might reflect underlying security concerns. Baseline behavioral documentation is essential for detecting signs of psychological manipulation or coercion. If hostile intelligence services attempt to influence your cooperation through remote psychological techniques, these patterns will provide early warning indicators. This explanation made no sense to Vernon, but he had learned not to question Ralph's increasingly elaborate theoretical frameworks for understanding their situation. The American operative had developed detailed contingency plans for dozens of scenarios that seemed to exist only in his imagination, including Russian psychological warfare operations, long-range surveillance techniques, and infiltration methods that exceeded anything Vernon had encountered during his career with the SVR. Ralph's documentation obsession extended beyond Vernon's activities to include exhaustively detailed weather observations, wildlife movement patterns, and analysis of vehicle traffic on distant highways that could occasionally be heard from their location. He had created a complex coding system for categorizing different types of information, with separate protocols for recording, cross-referencing, and analyzing the data he collected. The most disturbing development was Ralph's conviction that patterns in his accumulated data revealed systematic surveillance activities by hostile intelligence services. He would spend hours each evening analyzing his documentation, using mathematical formulas he had devised to identify correlations between different types of observations that supposedly indicated coordinated intelligence operations. "Look at this pattern," Ralph announced one evening, spreading dozens of charts and graphs across the kitchen table. Wildlife movement decreases by an average of 37% during 4-hour periods when atmospheric pressure drops below 29.4 inches of mercury. But on Tuesdays and Thursdays, this correlation reverses, suggesting artificial manipulation of local animal behavior through ultrasonic frequency broadcasts. Vernon stared at Ralph's elaborate analysis with a mixture of confusion and alarm. The charts were covered with color-coded symbols, mathematical calculations, and connecting lines that created patterns resembling the work of someone whose grip on reality was becoming seriously compromised. "Ralph, I think perhaps you are seeing connections that are not actually there," Vernon said carefully, trying not to trigger the increasingly defensive responses that Ralph displayed when his theories were questioned. "Sometimes patterns in data are just coincidence, not evidence of enemy operations." But Ralph had become convinced that Vernon's skepticism was itself evidence of successful Russian psychological manipulation. The SVR had obviously trained Vernon to discourage analytical thinking that might expose their surveillance techniques. Ralph began documenting Vernon's attempts to discourage his security analysis, categorizing these interactions as potential indicators of compromised loyalty. This paranoid interpretation created a feedback loop where every aspect of Vernon's behavior became suspicious. If Vernon supported Ralph's theories, it was evidence of deception designed to encourage false confidence. If Vernon questioned Ralph's conclusions, it was proof of psychological conditioning designed to prevent discovery of surveillance activities. Ralph found himself unable to trust any information provided by the man he was supposed to protect. The situation deteriorated further when Ralph began detecting what he interpreted as coded messages in their routine communications from CIA headquarters. Gladys's scheduled check-ins, which occurred every 72 hours through encrypted satellite phone, contained subtle variations in phrasing and timing that Ralph became convinced were deliberate signals about changing threat levels and operational requirements. Gladys said our situation remains stable, but she emphasized the word remains in a way that suggests underlying instability, Ralph explained to Vernon after one such communication. She also paused for 2.3 seconds before mentioning the weather forecast, which according to my analysis indicates elevated concern about surveillance detection. Vernon had been present during the phone call and heard nothing unusual in Gladys's tone or phrasing, but Ralph's interpretations had become so elaborate that contradicting them seemed pointless. The American operative had developed a comprehensive theoretical framework for understanding their situation that allowed him to extract hidden meanings from the most mundane interactions. More troubling was Ralph's growing conviction that the safe house itself had been deliberately selected to test his security procedures under conditions designed to maximize psychological stress. The building's isolation, which should have provided protection, instead created an environment where Ralph's obsessive tendencies could develop without external reality checks or professional oversight. This assignment wasn't designed to protect me, Vernon realized during a moment of clarity about their deteriorating situation. It was designed to study what happens when someone like Ralph is placed in an environment that amplifies his worst psychological tendencies. But Vernon was too psychologically fragile from his own trauma to effectively confront Ralph about his increasingly irrational behavior. The Russian defector was dependent on Ralph for protection and had no means of contacting CIA headquarters independently. He found himself trapped with an operative whose mental state was deteriorating in ways that made their situation more dangerous than the threats they were supposedly hiding from. Ralph's security protocols had become so elaborate and time-consuming that they interfered with basic daily activities like eating, sleeping, and maintaining personal hygiene. He was averaging less than 4 hours of sleep per night, spending the remaining time on security checks, documentation analysis, and improvised defensive preparations that served no practical purpose beyond satisfying his compulsive need for control. The most alarming development was Ralph's creation of detailed escape and evasion plans for scenarios that became increasingly fantastical and unlikely. He had developed specific protocols for responding to helicopter-borne assault teams, underground infiltration through non-existent tunnel systems, and coordinated attacks involving trained wildlife that had been conditioned to locate human targets. We need to prepare for the possibility that they will use bears or wolves as tracking animals, Ralph announced during one of his evening briefings about security procedures. Russian intelligence services have extensive experience with using trained animals for special operations, and the local wildlife population provides perfect cover for such tactics. These theoretical threats required elaborate countermeasures that Ralph spent days implementing. He constructed noise-making devices designed to deter animal approaches, created scent barriers using improvised chemical mixtures, and established multiple cache sites throughout the forest where emergency supplies were hidden, according to mathematical formulas that only he understood. Vernon watched these preparations with growing horror, realizing that Ralph was losing his ability to distinguish between realistic threats and paranoid fantasies. The American operative's once admirable attention to detail had metastasized into a comprehensive delusion system that provided explanations for every unusual sound, weather pattern, or wildlife sighting that occurred in their remote location. During his 9th week at the safe house, Ralph made a discovery that he believed confirmed all of his theories about systematic surveillance and psychological manipulation. While conducting one of his routine documentation reviews, he noticed that the timestamps on their electronic security recording showed patterns that he interpreted as evidence of sophisticated tampering designed to conceal surveillance activities. "They're editing our security footage in real time," Ralph announced triumphantly, showing Vernon a series of computer printouts covered with timestamps and mathematical calculations. "Look at these gaps in the recording timeline. Exactly 37 minutes and 43 seconds missing from each 8-hour period, always during atmospheric conditions that would optimize long-range surveillance equipment." Vernon examined the printouts without understanding the significance of Ralph's calculations. But he could see that the American operative had spent dozens of hours analyzing timing patterns that probably represented nothing more than normal system operations or minor technical glitches. "Ralph, maybe these time differences are just because the computer clocks are not perfectly synchronized," Vernon suggested gently. "Electronic equipment sometimes has small errors that create patterns in data that look suspicious but are actually normal." But Ralph interpreted Vernon's rational explanations as additional evidence of psychological conditioning, designed to prevent him from recognizing surveillance activities. He began documenting Vernon's attempts to discourage his analysis, adding this information to his growing files about potential security breaches and compromised loyalty indicators. The paranoid cycle had become self-reinforcing in ways that made rational intervention impossible. Every piece of contradictory evidence was incorporated into Ralph's conspiracy theories as proof of more sophisticated deception, and every attempt to provide alternative explanations was treated as confirmation of the very threats he believed he was uncovering. As Ralph's 10th week at the Montana safe house began, Vernon realized that their situation had become more dangerous than any external threat they might have faced. The man responsible for protecting him had developed psychological symptoms that made him increasingly unpredictable and potentially violent in his determination to maintain security through elaborate measures that existed only in his increasingly paranoid imagination. By his 11th week at the Montana safe house, Ralph Morrison's compulsive security behaviors had evolved into a complex system of rituals and protocols that consumed virtually every waking moment. What had begun as thorough professional procedures had metastasized into elaborate ceremonies of control that served no practical security purpose, but had become psychologically essential for his continued functioning. Ralph's daily routine now required 14 hours to complete properly. Beginning at 0347 hours with a comprehensive facility inspection that involved checking 247 individual security points in a precise sequence that could not be altered without compromising the entire system's effectiveness. Each checkpoint required specific documentation procedures, including timestamp verification, equipment status confirmation, and environmental condition analysis that Ralph recorded in a complex coding system of his own design. Vernon Kozlov had become an unwilling observer of this psychological deterioration, watching with growing alarm as Ralph's obsessive tendencies consumed more and more of their shared reality. The Russian defector was now required to follow strict movement protocols within the safe house, including designated pathways between rooms, specific timing requirements for daily activities, and behavioral guidelines that Ralph updated constantly based on his analysis of potential security vulnerabilities. "Ralph, I cannot live like prisoner in this place," Vernon protested during one of their increasingly rigid breakfast routines, which now required 43 minutes to complete, due to Ralph's insistence on following precise procedures for food preparation, consumption, and cleanup. "These rules you make are not keeping us safer. They are making us crazy people." But Ralph had convinced himself that every deviation from established protocols created exponentially increasing risks of detection and infiltration. He had calculated that a single procedural error could cascade into complete operational security failure within 72.6 hours, based on mathematical models that existed only in his increasingly paranoid imagination. The safe house itself had been transformed into a maze of improvised security measures that reflected Ralph's deteriorating mental state. Every room contained multiple layers of detection systems, including primitive early warning devices constructed from household materials, electronic equipment that had been modified far beyond its original specifications, and physical barriers designed to channel potential intruders through predetermined kill zones where Ralph could engage them effectively. Most disturbing was Ralph's creation of detailed tactical maps showing every possible approach route to their location, complete with estimated infiltration times, optimal weapon placements, and predetermined defensive positions for various threat scenarios. These maps covered every wall surface in his bedroom and showed a level of tactical analysis that exceeded anything justifiable for their actual situation. "Look at these infiltration vectors," Ralph explained to Vernon during one of his mandatory security briefings, pointing to dozens of red arrows drawn across topographical maps of their surrounding forest. Russian Spetsnaz doctrine calls for simultaneous approach from multiple directions to overwhelm defensive positions. But if we maintain proper surveillance protocols and implement appropriate countermeasures, we can channel their advance through these narrow corridors where individual operatives can be eliminated before they can coordinate their assault. Vernon stared at the elaborate battle plans with a mixture of horror and disbelief. Ralph was preparing for military engagements that had no connection to their actual circumstances, developing detailed strategies for combat scenarios that existed only in his obsessive imagination. The most alarming aspect of Ralph's condition was his absolute certainty about the accuracy of his threat assessments. He would spend hours each day analyzing data from his various surveillance systems, using statistical methods and pattern recognition techniques to identify what he believed were clear indicators of approaching danger. Every unusual sound, weather pattern, or wildlife sighting was incorporated into elaborate theories about systematic surveillance and infiltration preparation. The squirrel population density has decreased by 18% over the past 4 days, Ralph announced during one of his evening intelligence briefings. This correlates with a 7-degree shift in prevailing wind patterns and a 0.3 decrease in average atmospheric humidity. These environmental changes indicate systematic area reconnaissance using biological detection methods that are designed to identify human presence through subtle ecosystem disruption. These conclusions were based on hours of data collection and mathematical analysis that demonstrated Ralph's considerable analytical capabilities while simultaneously revealing the complete detachment from reality that characterized his current psychological state. He was applying genuine intelligence analysis techniques to imaginary threats, creating elaborate theoretical frameworks that felt internally consistent but had no basis in external reality. Vernon had initially attempted to reason with Ralph about the increasingly irrational nature of his security concerns, but these efforts only triggered more paranoid interpretations of potential psychological manipulation. Ralph now documented every instance where Vernon questioned his analysis, categorizing these interactions as evidence of successful enemy conditioning designed to undermine defensive preparations. "Vernon, your consistent attempts to discourage my security analysis follow patterns that are documented in Russian psychological warfare manuals," Ralph explained while updating his classified logs about potential loyalty compromises. "The timing, frequency, and specific content of your objections correspond exactly to techniques used for gradually eroding target confidence, inaccurate threat assessment capabilities. This accusation created a psychological trap where Vernon's natural responses to Ralph's irrational behavior were interpreted as confirmation of the very threats Ralph believed they were facing. The Russian defector found himself unable to communicate effectively with the man responsible for protecting him, since any attempt at rational discussion was treated as evidence of enemy influence. The situation became even more dangerous when Ralph began implementing what he called active countermeasures, designed to neutralize the psychological warfare techniques he believed were being used against them. These measures included periods of imposed silence to prevent subliminal conditioning through verbal manipulation, irregular meal schedules to disrupt biorhythm-based influence attempts, and sensory isolation procedures designed to eliminate external stimuli that might carry hidden psychological programming. We need to maintain operational security against frequency-based conditioning signals that could be transmitted through normal radio communications, Ralph announced while disconnecting their emergency communication equipment. Russian intelligence services use ultra-low frequency broadcasts to influence target behavior through subliminal psychological conditioning. Until I can develop appropriate filtering protocols, all external communications represent potential security breaches. This decision effectively isolated them from CIA headquarters and eliminated Vernon's only potential avenue for reporting Ralph's deteriorating psychological condition. The safe house, which should have provided protection and support, had become a prison where Vernon was trapped with an increasingly unstable operative, whose elaborate security measures posed more danger than any external threat. Ralph's documentation activities had expanded to include comprehensive psychological profiles of Vernon's behavior, designed to identify subtle indicators of compromised loyalty or external influence. These profiles required constant observation and analysis, with Ralph recording detailed information about Vernon's facial expressions, speech patterns, body language, and emotional responses to various stimuli. I've identified 47 specific behavioral indicators that correlate with psychological conditioning attempts, Ralph explained while reviewing pages of coded observations about Vernon's daily activities. The frequency and intensity of these indicators have increased by 23% over the past week, suggesting acceleration of enemy influence operations designed to compromise your cooperation with defensive protocols. Vernon realized that Ralph was now treating him as much as a potential threat as an asset to be protected. The American operative's paranoid analysis had created a worldview where everyone and everything represented possible components of elaborate enemy operations designed to breach their security and eliminate them both. The most frightening development was Ralph's preparation of what he called final defensive measures, designed to prevent capture and interrogation if their position was overrun by enemy forces. These measures included destructive charges placed throughout the safe house, elimination protocols for destroying sensitive materials, and detailed plans for what Ralph euphemistically called permanent security solutions for both himself and Vernon. If our defensive perimeter is breached and capture becomes inevitable, we need to ensure that no intelligence value can be extracted through interrogation techniques, Ralph explained, while showing Vernon the locations of various explosive devices he had constructed from household chemicals and electronic components. Russian interrogation methods are highly sophisticated and can extract information from even trained personnel. Complete elimination is the only way to guarantee operational security. Vernon understood that Ralph was planning their mutual suicide rather than risk capture by enemies who existed only in his paranoid imagination. The safe house had become a potential death trap, where Ralph's elaborate security measures could kill them both, in service of protecting them from threats that were entirely fictional. During his 12th week at the facility, Vernon made the desperate decision to attempt contact with CIA headquarters, despite Ralph's prohibition on external communications. But when he tried to access the satellite phone equipment, he discovered that Ralph had not simply disconnected the devices, but had systematically destroyed critical components to ensure that no unauthorized communications could occur. "You tried to compromise our communication security," Ralph announced, after discovering evidence of Vernon's attempt to contact their handlers. "This confirms my analysis about your psychological conditioning and represents a direct threat to operational security that requires immediate countermeasures." Vernon realized that Ralph now viewed him as an enemy agent rather than an asset to be protected. The American operative's paranoid worldview had evolved to the point where anyone who questioned his authority or attempted to circumvent his elaborate protocols was automatically classified as hostile. The safe house assignment had transformed into a hostage situation where Vernon was trapped with someone whose mental breakdown made him far more dangerous than any external threat they might face. As Ralph began implementing what he called enhanced security measures designed to prevent further attempts at unauthorized communication, Vernon understood that their situation had moved beyond psychological breakdown into territory where violence was not just possible, but increasingly likely. The man responsible for his protection had become the greatest threat to his survival. Ralph Morrison's psychological deterioration reached its ultimate conclusion during his 13th week at the Montana safe house. His elaborate security protocols had evolved into what he perceived as the final phase of their defensive operations. The safe house had become a fortress of paranoid delusions, with every room containing improvised security devices that Ralph monitored obsessively. Vernon Kozlov had become a prisoner, required to follow increasingly strict protocols that Ralph updated constantly. The Russian defector was now confined to a single room, under constant observation, with his activities scheduled to the minute. "Vernon, my analysis indicates your stress responses suggest successful psychological conditioning," Ralph announced during a mandatory briefing. "Enemy influence operations have achieved deeper penetration than assessed, requiring enhanced security measures." The enhanced measures included physical restraints during Ralph's inspections, communication restrictions, and behavioral monitoring that required documenting every action Vernon displayed throughout each day. Ralph had convinced himself that Vernon's desperation was sophisticated psychological warfare designed to compromise his analytical objectivity. Every plea for reasonable treatment was catalogued as evidence of enemy conditioning. The most disturbing development was Ralph's creation of terminal security protocols, designed to prevent intelligence extraction if their defenses failed. These protocols included plans for destroying all evidence and ensuring no operational intelligence could be recovered by hostile forces. The facility is now equipped with comprehensive sanitization capabilities, Ralph explained, while showing Vernon the locations of destructive devices he had placed throughout the safe house. "If perimeter security is compromised, automated systems will ensure complete elimination of all personnel within 47 seconds. Vernon realized with horror that Ralph had rigged the building with improvised explosive devices constructed from household chemicals and electronic components. The safe house had become a potential crematorium where Ralph's paranoid measures could incinerate them both, rather than risk capture by enemies who existed only in his delusional worldview. Ralph spoke about potential destruction with methodical precision, treating mass suicide as a logical extension of security protocols rather than evidence of complete psychological breakdown. "Gladys will understand that we maintained operational security," Ralph said while testing electronic triggers. "Complete sanitization is preferable to compromise." But Vernon knew their communications with CIA headquarters had been severed by Ralph's systematic destruction of their satellite equipment. Gladys had no knowledge of their situation. The breaking point came when Ralph detected what he interpreted as clear evidence their perimeter had been compromised. A family of deer feeding near the safe house suddenly changed behavioral patterns, displaying what Ralph calculated as abnormal stress responses, indicating human presence. Wildlife behavior modification confirms advanced infiltration, Ralph announced while activating final defensive measures. Enemy forces have achieved tactical positions and are preparing coordinated assault operations. Vernon watched in terror as Ralph began implementing terminal security protocols, activating electronic systems that would detonate his explosive network within predetermined intervals. "Ralph, please listen," Vernon said desperately. "There are no enemy soldiers. There are no psychological warfare operations. You are experiencing serious mental illness, making you believe in threats that do not exist." But Ralph interpreted Vernon's confrontation as confirmation that the Russians' conditioning had reached its final phase. This represented ultimate proof that terminal security measures were immediately necessary. "Your conditioning protocols have shifted to direct psychological assault tactics," Ralph observed while making final adjustments to his timing systems. "Complete sanitization must be implemented within 18 minutes to prevent intelligence compromise." Vernon attempted to physically interfere with Ralph's activation of the explosive systems, but found the American operative had anticipated this and designed his protocols to prevent external interference. The timing devices were secured beyond Vernon's reach. "Attempted sabotage confirms total compromise," Ralph announced while beginning the final countdown sequence. "This validates all previous threat assessments and demonstrates the necessity of terminal protocols." As Ralph initiated what he believed were heroic security measures, Vernon understood he was about to die not from Russian assassination attempts, but because of one man's complete psychological breakdown that had transformed protective instincts into homicidal delusions. The safe house that should have provided sanctuary had become a tomb, where Ralph's obsessive need for control had evolved into the ultimate expression of security consciousness, the elimination of everything he was supposed to protect. As the Montana wilderness erupted in flames that would leave no evidence of what had occurred, Ralph Morrison achieved the perfect security he had been seeking. A silence so complete that no intelligence could ever be extracted from the ashes of his elaborate defensive measures. CIA Analyst. Horace Fitzgerald had always taken pride in his methodical approach to intelligence analysis. During his 15-year career with the agency, he had developed a reputation for thorough, detailed work that consistently identified patterns and connections that other analysts missed. His cubicle on the 4th floor of CIA headquarters in Langley was notorious for its organizational systems, with color-coded filing systems and meticulously maintained research databases that allowed him to cross-reference information from multiple sources with remarkable efficiency. When Director Mildred Patterson personally assigned Horace to review a collection of recently declassified Cold War intelligence files, he understood immediately that the project represented both an opportunity and a significant professional challenge. The files had been sealed for decades, and their sudden release for historical analysis suggested they contained information of considerable sensitivity and potential importance. Director Patterson was a formidable woman in her late 50s who had risen through the agency's ranks during the particularly challenging period of the 1980s and 1990s. Her office on the 7th floor was legendary among CIA personnel for its intimidating atmosphere, with dark wood paneling and formal portraits of former directors creating an environment that discouraged casual conversation. Horace, these files represent one of the most comprehensive collections of Cold War intelligence operations that has ever been released for historical analysis, Director Patterson explained. gesturing toward several large boxes stacked near her desk. The material covers approximately 20 years of operations, from 1963 to 1983, focusing primarily on Soviet intelligence activities and CIA countermeasures. The boxes contained thousands of documents, including operational reports, surveillance photographs, intercepted communications, and psychological profiles of various foreign intelligence officers. Horace estimated that the complete review would require at least 6 months of intensive analysis, possibly longer depending on the complexity of the interconnections between different operations. "What specific objectives should guide my analysis?" Horace asked, though he suspected the answer would be deliberately vague to avoid influencing his conclusions. "We need a comprehensive assessment of operational effectiveness, identification of any patterns that might inform current intelligence activities, and documentation of any unresolved questions that might warrant further investigation," Director Patterson replied. "Your reputation for thorough analysis made you the obvious choice for this project." Horace felt both honored and slightly apprehensive about the assignment. Historical analysis of classified intelligence operations required balancing scholarly objectivity with operational security considerations, and the sheer volume of material suggested months of intensive work that would demand considerable psychological stamina. "Will I have access to additional resources if I need consultation on specific technical or operational questions?" Director Patterson nodded toward a woman sitting quietly near the window, whom Horace hadn't noticed during their initial conversation. "This is Bernice Kowalski from our Historical Intelligence Collection. She'll be available to assist with archival research and provide context for any operational details that require clarification." Bernice appeared to be in her early 40s, with the kind of precise scholarly demeanor that Horace associated with the agency's most accomplished researchers. She had been taking detailed notes during their conversation, and her questions about the project's scope suggested extensive familiarity with Cold War intelligence operations. "Bernice will also help ensure that your analysis maintains appropriate classification boundaries," Director Patterson added. "Some of the material in these files remains sensitive despite official declassification, and we need to be careful about what information appears in your final reports." 3 days later, Horace began his systematic review of the Cold War intelligence files in a secure reading room in the basement of CIA headquarters. The room was windowless and sterile, furnished with metal tables, fluorescent lighting, and multiple security cameras that monitored all research activities. The environment was designed to minimize distractions and maintain absolute security for sensitive materials. The first box contained operational reports from CIA activities in Eastern Europe during the mid-1960s, including detailed accounts of agent recruitment, surveillance operations, and intelligence gathering activities in countries throughout the Soviet sphere of influence. Horace was immediately struck by the sophistication and scope of the operations described in the documents. Many of the reports contained information that was new to Horace despite his extensive knowledge of Cold War history. The level of detail about specific operations, individual agents, and intelligence methodologies provided insights into CIA capabilities that had never been publicly disclosed. Horace realized that his analysis would contribute significantly to historical understanding of intelligence activities during this crucial period. But as Horace delved deeper into the files, he began noticing patterns and connections that seemed to extend far beyond the official scope of his research project. Many of the operations described in the documents were interconnected in ways that suggested coordinated strategic planning, on a scale that exceeded anything in Horace's previous experience with declassified intelligence materials. More intriguing were references to operations and individuals that didn't appear in any of the standard historical accounts of Cold War intelligence activities. Horace found mentions of code names, operational sites, and tactical approaches that seemed to represent completely undocumented aspects of CIA activities during the 1960s and 1970s. After 2 weeks of intensive reading, Horace had filled several notebooks with detailed observations and preliminary analysis. The material was far richer and more complex than he had anticipated, and he was beginning to identify research questions that would require months of additional investigation to answer comprehensively. During his first consultation meeting with Bernice, Horace shared some of his initial observations and asked for her assistance in understanding certain operational details. "Bernice, I'm finding references to several operation code names that don't appear in any of the standard Cold War intelligence histories. Names like Project Nightingale, Operation Carousel, and Blackwater Initiative. Can you provide any context for these operations?" Bernice consulted her own research files before responding. Those particular operations were highly compartmentalized, even within the agency. Most of the personnel involved were operating under deep cover, and operational security was maintained through very limited information sharing. "Do we have any supplementary documentation about these operations? I'm finding fragmentary references that suggest they were quite significant, but I need more complete information to assess their historical importance." Bernice's expression became slightly guarded. "Some of that material may still be classified at levels beyond your current clearance authorization. I'll need to check with Director Patterson about whether additional documentation can be made available." This response puzzled Horace, since Director Patterson had assured him that all necessary materials would be accessible for his analysis. The suggestion that some files remained beyond his clearance level implied that his research project might be more limited in scope than he had understood. Over the following weeks, Horace became increasingly absorbed in the intelligence files. He was working 12 to 14 hours per day, often forgetting to eat meals as he traced connections between different operations and attempted to understand the strategic logic underlying various CIA activities. The work was intellectually stimulating in ways that reminded Horace why he had chosen intelligence analysis as a career. The puzzle-like nature of piecing together fragmentary information from multiple sources to reconstruct complete operational pictures provided the kind of analytical challenge that he found deeply satisfying. But Horace also began noticing that his intense focus on the classified materials was affecting other aspects of his life. He was having difficulty sleeping, partly because his mind continued processing information from the files even after he left the office. He found himself thinking about operational details and strategic implications during conversations with friends and family, sometimes losing track of social interactions because his attention was focused on intelligence questions. More concerning was Horace's growing conviction that the files contained information of much greater contemporary relevance than anyone had suggested when he accepted the assignment. Many of the operations described in the document seemed to have implications for current intelligence activities, and some of the strategic approaches appeared to be directly applicable to ongoing CIA operations in various parts of the world. "Bernice, I'm beginning to think these files aren't just historical documents," Horace said during their 4th weekly consultation meeting. "Some of the operational methodologies and strategic approaches described here seem to be directly relevant to current intelligence activities." Bernice nodded thoughtfully. Historical intelligence analysis often reveals continuities between past and present operations. The agency has always built on previous experience when developing new operational approaches. But this seems to be more than just general continuity. I'm finding specific references to ongoing operations, including code names and geographical locations that correspond to current CIA activities. Bernice's expression became more serious. "Horace, you need to be very careful about drawing connections between historical materials and current operations. That kind of analysis falls outside the scope of your authorized research project." But Horace was finding it increasingly difficult to limit his analysis to purely historical questions. The files seemed to contain a comprehensive blueprint for intelligence operations that transcended any particular historical period, and understanding their full implications required considering their contemporary relevance. As Horace entered his 6th week of intensive file analysis, he realized that the project was changing him in ways that extended far beyond his professional responsibilities. The constant exposure to classified information about covert operations was altering his understanding of how intelligence agencies actually functioned, and this knowledge was affecting his perception of current events and political developments in ways that felt both enlightening and disturbing. By his 7th week reviewing the classified Cold War intelligence files, Horace Fitzgerald had developed what could only be described as an obsessive relationship with the material. His systematic approach to analysis had gradually transformed into a compulsive need to examine every document multiple times, searching for connections and patterns that might reveal deeper strategic truths about CIA operations spanning several decades. His secure reading room in the basement of CIA headquarters had become a second home where Horace spent increasingly long hours, often arriving before dawn and remaining until security personnel insisted that he leave for the night. The metal tables were now covered with elaborate organizational systems consisting of color-coded index cards, timeline charts, and relationship diagrams that mapped connections between hundreds of different operations and personnel. Director Mildred Patterson had expressed concern about Horace's work habits during their most recent progress meeting, noting that he appeared to be losing weight and showing signs of chronic sleep deprivation. But Horace had dismissed these observations, insisting that the complexity of the material required intensive analysis to understand its full implications. Director Patterson, these files contain information that fundamentally changes our understanding of Cold War intelligence operations, Horace had explained enthusiastically, spreading dozens of documents across her office desk. The scope and sophistication of CIA activities during this period exceeded anything that has been previously documented in historical accounts. Director Patterson had examined Horace's analysis materials with obvious concern. "Horace, your work has been extremely thorough, but I'm worried that you may be losing perspective on the project's objectives. We need historical analysis, not operational planning for current activities." But Horace was convinced that Director Patterson didn't fully understand the significance of what he was discovering in the files. The operations described in the documents weren't simply historical artifacts, but components of an ongoing strategic framework that continued to guide CIA activities into the present day. The most compelling evidence was the recurring appearance of certain operational methodologies and personnel across operations spanning 20 years. Horace had identified what appeared to be a core group of CIA officers who had participated in dozens of different operations, sometimes using multiple identities and cover personas that suggested extraordinarily sophisticated long-term planning. During his 8th week of analysis, Horace made a discovery that confirmed his growing conviction about the contemporary relevance of the historical files. Buried in a routine operational report from 1971 was a reference to a strategic planning document titled Perpetual Operations Framework that outlined CIA methodologies for conducting intelligence activities across multiple decades. "Bernice, I need your help locating additional documentation about something called the Perpetual Operations Framework," Horace said during their weekly consultation meeting. I've found several references suggesting it was a comprehensive strategic planning document that guided CIA operations from the 1960s through at least the 1980s. Bernice consulted her research files, but her expression suggested she was unfamiliar with the referenced document. Horace, I don't have any information about a perpetual operations framework. Are you certain about the accuracy of those references? I've found mentions in at least 6 different operational reports spanning a 10-year period. The references suggest it was a highly classified strategic document that was known to senior CIA personnel, but never widely distributed. Bernice's response was more cautious than usual. Horace, some of the documents in these files may contain references to operational concepts that were never actually implemented. Intelligence planning often includes theoretical frameworks that don't correspond to real programs. But Horace was becoming increasingly skeptical of Bernice's explanations for the gaps in available documentation. Her consistent inability to locate supplementary materials about the most intriguing aspects of his research suggested either incompetence or deliberate withholding of information. More troubling was Horace's growing suspicion that his historical analysis project might be serving purposes beyond those that Director Patterson had described. The specific selection of files for his review seemed designed to expose him to particular types of information, and the timing of his assignment coincided with current CIA operations that appeared to be using methodologies described in the historical documents. Horace began conducting his own research outside the official channels provided by Bernice, using his security clearance to access CIA databases and historical archives that weren't directly related to his assigned project. This unauthorized research revealed additional information that supported his theories about the ongoing relevance of Cold War operational frameworks. The most significant discovery was evidence that many of the code names and operational sites referenced in the historical files were still being used by the CIA in contemporary operations. Project Nightingale, which Horace had initially assumed was a Cold War-era operation, appeared to be an ongoing program with activities in several countries where the CIA was currently conducting intelligence operations. Director Patterson, I need to discuss some developments in my analysis that may have implications for current CIA activities, Horace said during their next scheduled meeting, bringing several boxes of additional materials he had compiled through his independent research. Director Patterson's expression became immediately guarded when she saw the scope of materials Horace had assembled. Horace, what kind of additional research have you been conducting beyond your authorized project? I've been tracing connections between historical operations and current CIA activities. The patterns I've identified suggest that many of the strategic frameworks developed during the Cold War are still guiding contemporary intelligence operations. Director Patterson's tone became distinctly cooler. Horace, your assignment was to conduct historical analysis of declassified materials, not to investigate current operational activities. What you're describing falls well outside the scope of your authorized research. But Horace was convinced that Director Patterson was deliberately trying to limit his analysis to prevent him from discovering information that would be embarrassing or problematic for current CIA leadership. The scope and consistency of the patterns he had identified made coincidental explanations seem increasingly implausible. Director Patterson, I think these files were selected specifically to expose me to information about ongoing operations. The Perpetual Operations Framework appears to be a real strategic planning document that has guided CIA activities for decades, and my analysis suggests it's still being implemented. Director Patterson stood up from her desk, signaling the end of their meeting. Horace, I think you need to take some time off to rest and gain perspective on your work. Your analysis has become unfocused and speculative in ways that concern me. But Horace interpreted Director Patterson's response as confirmation that his research was uncovering information that CIA leadership preferred to keep concealed. Her insistence on limiting his analysis to purely historical questions seemed designed to prevent him from understanding the full scope of ongoing intelligence operations. Over the following days, Horace's research activities became increasingly frenetic and disorganized. He was working 18 to 20 hours per day, consuming excessive amounts of caffeine to maintain alertness, and neglecting basic personal hygiene and nutrition in his obsession with analyzing the classified files. His secure reading room had been transformed into what resembled a detective's investigation center, with documents, photographs, and charts covering every available surface. Horace had developed elaborate theories about connections between different operations, some of which required assumptions about CIA capabilities and activities that exceeded anything documented in the official files. More disturbing was Horace's growing paranoia about surveillance of his research activities. He began suspecting that Director Patterson and Bernice were monitoring his work more closely than they had initially indicated, and he started taking elaborate precautions to conceal the full scope of his independent investigations. "They don't want me to understand the complete picture," Horace confided to himself while working alone in the reading room. "The historical files are just the beginning. The real operations are still classified at levels beyond my clearance." Horace began staying at CIA headquarters overnight, sleeping in the reading room rather than returning to his apartment where he suspected his activities might be under surveillance. He was convinced that his research had revealed information of such sensitivity that his safety might be at risk if he discussed his discoveries with unauthorized personnel. The boundary between legitimate intelligence analysis and paranoid speculation was becoming increasingly difficult for Horace to distinguish. His theories about the perpetual operations framework and ongoing CIA activities were based on patterns he had identified through intensive analysis, but they required inferential leaps that exceeded the evidence available in the declassified files. During his 10th week on the project, Horace experienced what he would later recognize as his first significant break from reality. While reviewing a particularly complex operational report, he began hearing voices discussing his research activities, as if CIA personnel were conducting a meeting about his discoveries in an adjacent room. "Horace's analysis is becoming too comprehensive," one voice seemed to say. "He's identifying connections that were supposed to remain compartmentalized. We may need to terminate his access to the files," another voice replied. His psychological profile suggested he might develop obsessive tendencies under this kind of intensive analysis. Horace spent hours listening to these phantom conversations while continuing his review of the classified documents, trying to determine whether the voices represented actual surveillance or products of his stress-induced psychological state. During his 11th week analyzing the classified Cold War intelligence files, Horace Fitzgerald's psychological condition deteriorated to the point where distinguishing between documented information and his own speculative interpretations became virtually impossible. The combination of chronic sleep deprivation, social isolation, and obsessive focus on complex conspiracy theories had created a mental state where normal reality testing mechanisms were severely compromised. His secure reading room in the CIA headquarters basement had been transformed into what could only be described as the workspace of someone experiencing a psychological breakdown. Documents were arranged in elaborate patterns that made sense only to Horace, with connecting lines drawn between apparently random pieces of information. The walls were covered with hand-drawn charts showing alleged relationships between Cold War operations and current CIA activities, based on increasingly tenuous evidence and speculative connections. The voices that Horace had been hearing for several days were becoming more frequent and more specific in their content. Instead of general discussions about his research activities, he now heard detailed conversations about CIA operational planning that seemed to be occurring in real time just beyond his hearing range. Horace's analysis has revealed the perpetual operations framework, one voice seemed to say during his overnight research sessions. His psychological profile indicated he would develop obsessive tendencies, but we underestimated his analytical capabilities. The framework was never intended to be discovered through historical analysis, another voice replied. We need to implement containment protocols before his research compromises ongoing operations. Horace spent hours documenting these phantom conversations in his notebooks, treating them as additional intelligence sources that confirmed his theories about CIA activities. The consistency and operational sophistication of the information he was hearing seemed to validate his belief that he was overhearing actual planning sessions rather than experiencing auditory hallucinations. More disturbing were the visual distortions that Horace began experiencing during his intensive document analysis sessions. Text on classified reports would appear to change when he wasn't looking directly at it, revealing additional information that wasn't visible upon closer examination. Photographs accompanying operational reports showed faces and locations that differed from what Horace remembered seeing during previous reviews of the same materials. These perceptual anomalies convinced Horace that the classified files contained hidden information that was only visible to analysts with sufficient clearance levels or psychological conditioning. He developed elaborate theories about subliminal text and concealed imagery that the CIA used to communicate sensitive operational details while maintaining plausible deniability about classification levels. Bernice, I'm discovering information in these files that wasn't visible during my initial analysis, Horace explained during what would be their final consultation meeting. The documents appear to contain multiple layers of information that become apparent only after prolonged exposure and detailed study. Bernice's expression showed immediate concern as she observed Horace's deteriorated physical appearance and increasingly erratic speech patterns. He had lost considerable weight over the past weeks. His clothes were wrinkled and stained, and his eyes had the hollow, unfocused look of someone who hadn't slept properly in days. Horace, what you're describing sounds like perceptual distortions that can occur under conditions of extreme stress and sleep deprivation, Bernice said carefully. Document analysis doesn't typically reveal different information upon repeated viewing, unless the analyst's psychological state is affecting their perception. But Horace dismissed her concerns as evidence that she lacked the security clearance necessary to understand the sophisticated information management techniques that the CIA used for highly sensitive materials. He was convinced that his prolonged exposure to the classified files had somehow enhanced his analytical capabilities, allowing him to perceive operational details that were invisible to less experienced researchers. Bernice, you need to understand that these documents contain information that operates on multiple levels of classification, Horace explained with the fervent intensity of someone sharing a profound revelation. The perpetual operations framework uses subliminal information encoding to communicate sensitive operational details while maintaining security through perceptual filtering. Bernice's response was more direct than usual. Horace, I think you need to take immediate medical leave and see a mental health professional. What you're describing suggests you're experiencing symptoms that require clinical attention. But Horace interpreted Bernice's suggestion as an attempt to prevent him from completing his analysis of the classified files. Her sudden concern about his mental health seemed too convenient, occurring precisely when his research was revealing the most sensitive information about ongoing CIA operations. You're trying to stop me from discovering the truth about the framework, Horace accused, backing away from Bernice as if she represented a physical threat. Director Patterson assigned me to this project, knowing that I would eventually uncover information that the agency prefers to keep concealed. Bernice left the reading room to contact Director Patterson, but Horace remained behind to continue his analysis of the classified documents. He was convinced that Bernice's departure was part of a coordinated effort to terminate his research project before he could document his discoveries about the perpetual operations framework and its ongoing implementation. Over the following days, Horace's work habits became even more compulsive and disorganized. He was sleeping only in brief periods of 20 or 30 minutes, often collapsing from exhaustion while sitting at his analysis tables. His notebooks were filled with increasingly illegible handwriting that documented complex theories about CIA operations spanning multiple decades. The visual distortions were becoming more severe and more frequent. Horace would read detailed operational reports that seemed to disappear or transform when he attempted to make photocopies for his research files. Surveillance photographs showed faces that he recognized from other documents, suggesting systematic personnel recycling across operations that spanned 20 years. Most disturbing were the changes in Director Patterson's behavior during their increasingly infrequent meetings. Instead of the supportive supervisor who had initially assigned him to the project, she now seemed evasive and potentially hostile, asking probing questions about his research methodologies and expressing concern about his psychological stability. Horace, your analysis has become unfocused and speculative in ways that concern me greatly, Director Patterson said during what would be their final official meeting. I'm suspending your access to the classified files pending a comprehensive medical and psychological evaluation. But Horace was certain that Director Patterson's decision was motivated by his discovery of information that she had never intended him to find. The timing of the suspension, occurring immediately after his identification of the perpetual operations framework, seemed too coincidental to represent legitimate concern about his mental health. Director Patterson, you assigned me to this project knowing that the files contained information about ongoing operations, Horace accused during their confrontational final meeting. The perpetual operations framework proves that Cold War methodologies are still being implemented, and you're trying to prevent me from documenting this continuity. Director Patterson's response was firm and final. Horace, you're experiencing psychological symptoms that make continued work impossible. Security will escort you from the building, and you're required to report for medical evaluation tomorrow morning. But as security personnel approached to remove him from the CIA headquarters building, Horace realized that his research had revealed information of such sensitivity that his personal safety might now be at risk. The agency's sudden concern about his mental health seemed designed to discredit his discoveries rather than address genuine medical issues. During his final hours in the secure reading room, Horace attempted to conceal copies of the most sensitive documents he had analyzed, hoping to continue his research from external locations where CIA surveillance would be more difficult to maintain. But when he tried to remove materials from the reading room, he discovered that many of the documents he remembered analyzing had apparently disappeared from the files. The missing materials included all references to the perpetual operations framework, the operational reports that had first suggested ongoing CIA activities, and the personnel files that documented systematic identity recycling across multiple decades of operations. Either Horace's memory of these documents was seriously distorted, or someone had systematically removed evidence of the most sensitive information he had discovered. As Horace was escorted from CIA headquarters by security personnel, he carried only his personal notebooks filled with increasingly illegible handwriting that documented theories and connections that seemed to make perfect sense to him, but might appear completely incoherent to external observers. The boundary between legitimate intelligence analysis and paranoid delusion had become impossible for Horace to distinguish. His months of intensive exposure to classified materials had either revealed genuine evidence of ongoing CIA operations, or had triggered a psychological breakdown that generated elaborate conspiracy theories from fragmentary historical information. The most terrifying possibility was that he would never be able to determine which interpretation was correct, leaving him permanently uncertain about the reliability of his own analytical capabilities and the nature of the reality he thought he had discovered through his research. Following his forced removal from CIA headquarters, Horace Fitzgerald's psychological condition deteriorated at an accelerated pace that would have alarmed any mental health professional trained to recognize the warning signs of complete dissociative breakdown. The familiar environment of his Arlington apartment provided no psychological refuge from the obsessive thoughts and paranoid interpretations that had consumed his mind during the final weeks of his classified document analysis project. Within hours of arriving home, Horace had transformed his apartment into an exact replica of his CIA reading room, covering every available wall surface with hand-drawn charts, photocopied document fragments, and elaborate relationship diagrams that mapped alleged connections between Cold War operations and current intelligence activities. The living room, bedroom, kitchen, and even the bathroom walls were covered with what appeared to be the frenzied work of someone whose grip on reality had become completely compromised. But without access to the original classified documents that had formed the foundation of his research, Horace found himself unable to verify most of the specific details and operational connections that he remembered discovering. This inability to confirm his findings created a psychological feedback loop, where doubt about specific facts led to increasingly elaborate conspiracy theories designed to explain why external verification was impossible. The voices that had begun during his final weeks at CIA headquarters not only continued in his apartment, but became more frequent, more specific, and seemingly more coordinated in their content. Instead of the general discussions about his research that he had initially experienced, Horace now heard detailed conversations about his psychological condition, his family background, and his potential future treatment that seemed to be occurring in specific apartments throughout his building. Subject demonstrates classic symptoms of paranoid schizophrenia with obsessive-compulsive features. One voice observed from what appeared to be the apartment directly above his bedroom. The classified document exposure triggered a psychological cascade that proceeded exactly according to our predictive models. Horace's analytical capabilities made him an ideal test subject for studying how high-functioning intelligence personnel respond to systematic information overload. Another voice replied from what seemed to be his downstairs neighbor's living room. His breakdown has provided extensive data about the psychological limits of document analysis protocols. These phantom conversations convinced Horace that his apartment building was actually a sophisticated CIA research facility designed to monitor and study intelligence personnel who had experienced various forms of psychological breakdown during sensitive assignments. Every resident was presumably an agency employee, participating in an elaborate, long-term research program that studied the mental deterioration of analysts under controlled conditions designed to simulate operational stress. But even as Horace developed increasingly elaborate theories about systematic surveillance and psychological experimentation, part of his mind recognized that these interpretations might themselves be symptoms of his deteriorating psychological condition. The voices could be entirely internal phenomena generated by his exhausted and overwhelmed consciousness, and his theories about coordinated CIA monitoring might represent classic paranoid delusions triggered by professional isolation, chronic sleep deprivation, and prolonged exposure to classified information. The most terrifying aspect of his situation was the complete erosion of his ability to distinguish between external reality and internal psychological experience. Horace had always prided himself on his rigorous analytical capabilities and rational thinking processes, but these cognitive skills had become completely unreliable for assessing even the most basic aspects of his immediate environment. On his fourth day at home, Horace attempted to contact Bernice Kowalski to request clarification about specific documents and operational details he remembered analyzing, hoping that external verification from his research colleague might help him distinguish between genuine memories of classified materials and stress-induced psychological distortions. But when he called the CIA Historical Intelligence Collection Office using the direct number he had been given months earlier, the receptionist claimed that no employee named Bernice Kowalski worked for the agency in any capacity. "I need to speak with Bernice Kowalski immediately about the Cold War intelligence files project that she was assigned to assist with," Horace explained, hearing the desperate edge in his own voice but unable to control his emotional response to this unexpected obstacle. "Sir, we have no record of any employee by that name in our department or anywhere else in the Historical Intelligence Collection Division," the receptionist replied, with the kind of patient tone typically used with callers who seem to be experiencing some form of mental disturbance. "Perhaps you're thinking of someone from a different CIA division or a different intelligence agency entirely." Horace spent the remainder of that day calling every CIA office and department he could locate through official directories, but no one seemed to have any record of Bernice Kowalski's employment with the agency. This discovery suggested either that his memories of their months of weekly consultation meetings were entirely fictional products of his deteriorating mental state, or that Bernice had been operating under a completely false identity as part of a psychological research program that he hadn't been informed about. Similarly disturbing was his inability to verify any aspect of his research project when he attempted to contact Director Mildred Patterson's office directly. Her assistant informed him that Director Patterson was unavailable for any communications, and that no information about ongoing or completed research projects could be discussed over unsecured telephone lines with former employees who no longer possessed active security clearances. The evasiveness of these responses seemed to confirm Horace's growing suspicions about systematic CIA cover-up activities designed to conceal the true nature of his research assignment, but they could equally indicate that his phone calls were being interpreted as evidence of continued psychological instability that required careful management to prevent security breaches or public embarrassment. The uncertainty became complete when Horace began searching for external documentation of the Cold War intelligence operations that had formed the core of his analysis. Despite spending days searching through online databases, academic archives, historical collections, and declassified document repositories, he found absolutely no external confirmation of the specific operations, personnel, or methodologies that he remembered analyzing in the classified files. Either the materials he had been studying contained information so extraordinarily sensitive that no aspect of it had ever been publicly acknowledged in any form, or his months of intensive document analysis had been based entirely on psychological projections and stress-induced fantasies rather than actual documentary evidence. During his second week at home, Horace experienced what he would later recognize as a complete psychological break from any form of consensus reality. While attempting to organize his research notes into coherent analytical summaries, he began seeing CIA operatives conducting systematic surveillance activities from positions throughout his apartment building and the surrounding neighborhood. These weren't fleeting glimpses or peripheral visions that might be dismissed as tricks of light or imagination. Horace observed detailed surveillance operations involving multiple personnel using sophisticated electronic equipment to monitor his activities, record his conversations, and analyze his behavioral patterns. He could see agents positioned at windows in adjacent buildings, technical specialists installing monitoring equipment in hallways, and supervisory personnel reviewing surveillance data on handheld devices. Horace spent hours each day documenting these surveillance operations in his notebooks, describing the equipment specifications, personnel rotations, and operational methodologies he observed with the kind of technical precision that had characterized his professional intelligence analysis. While he was recording these observations, they seemed completely real and entirely consistent with advanced CIA surveillance capabilities that he understood from his years of experience with the agency. But when Horace reviewed these surveillance reports during his more lucid moments, they described impossible operational scenarios that could only have been generated by his severely compromised psychological state. The level of personnel and resources required for the surveillance activities he was documenting would have exceeded anything justified by his actual importance to CIA operations, and many of the technical capabilities he described didn't correspond to any surveillance methodologies he had encountered during his 15-year career. The visual hallucinations were accompanied by increasingly complex auditory experiences that seemed to provide confirmation of the surveillance activities he was observing. Horace heard detailed operational briefings about his case being conducted in apartments throughout his building, with CIA supervisors and psychological specialists discussing his mental condition, his research discoveries, and the appropriate protocols for managing his continued access to classified information. Subject's psychological deterioration has proceeded beyond our most pessimistic projections, one phantom voice explained during what seemed to be a comprehensive case review session. The obsessive personality traits that made him effective for intensive document analysis have created a feedback loop that's driving him toward the complete dissociation from reality. The question now is whether any of his analytical conclusions were based on genuine intelligence rather than psychological artifacts. Another voice replied with the clinical detachment of a researcher reviewing experimental data. His capabilities were considerable before the mental breakdown began, but separating legitimate discoveries from paranoid speculation may be impossible. More importantly, a third voice added, we need to assess whether he represents a security risk in his current psychological state. His knowledge of classified materials combined with his apparent inability to distinguish between real and imagined threats could compromise ongoing operations if he attempts to contact external parties. These conversations seem to provide external validation for multiple interpretations of his experience simultaneously. His research might have revealed genuinely sensitive CIA operations that were now the subject of damage control efforts. Alternatively, his entire analytical project might have been a psychological experiment designed to study how intelligence personnel would respond to prolonged exposure to fragmentary classified information. Or, most disturbing of all, the conversations might be entirely internal phenomena generated by his collapsing mind as it attempted to provide explanations for experiences that exceeded his ability to process rationally. During his third week at home, Horace's sleep schedule completely disintegrated under the combined pressure of his obsessive research activities and the constant auditory surveillance he was experiencing. He found himself staying awake for 48 to 72-hour periods, surviving on excessive amounts of caffeine while attempting to document every aspect of the intelligence operations he believed were targeting him. But the chronic sleep deprivation accelerated his psychological deterioration in ways that made distinguishing between observation and hallucination virtually impossible. Horace began seeing classified documents that he didn't remember analyzing, containing information about current CIA operations that seemed directly relevant to his research into historical intelligence activities. These phantom documents appeared throughout his apartment at random times, always disappearing when he attempted to examine them closely or make copies for his files. More disturbing were the changes in his reflection that Horace began noticing when he looked in mirrors throughout his apartment. Sometimes he saw himself as he expected, but increasingly often his reflection showed a stranger who appeared to be playing the role of Horace Fitzgerald, while possessing no authentic, that was designed to test the psychological limits of intensive document analysis procedures. The classified files he had been studying were apparently a carefully curated collection of historical materials mixed with fictional operational reports, selected specifically to trigger paranoid responses in subjects with his particular psychological profile. The evaluation reports predicted his growing obsession with the perpetual operations framework with remarkable accuracy, describing it as a typical response pattern for subjects exposed to fragmentary information about intelligence operations spanning multiple decades. Even his current paranoid interpretations of surveillance activities and psychological experimentation were apparently anticipated outcomes that had been built into the experimental design. But the most chilling discovery was a termination protocol dated for the following week. According to the document, Horace's participation in Operation Mindbridge was scheduled to conclude with his involuntary commitment to a CIA medical facility where he would receive comprehensive psychological treatment until his condition stabilized sufficiently to ensure operational security. Horace stared at these documents with a mixture of horror and profound uncertainty about their authenticity. They might represent genuine evidence of psychological experimentation conducted without his informed consent, or they might be elaborate fabrications created by his deteriorating mind to provide a paranoid explanation for his mental breakdown. The boundary between documented fact and psychological projection had become so thoroughly compromised that he could no longer make meaningful distinctions. As Horace sat in his apartment surrounded by months of research materials that might represent either genuine intelligence analysis or the elaborate fantasies of someone who had lost contact with reality, he heard vehicles approaching outside his building. The sounds were measured and purposeful, suggesting multiple personnel arriving with tactical coordination for a planned operation. Through his window, Horace could see unmarked vans and sedans positioning themselves around his building's entrances. Personnel in civilian clothing were deploying with the kind of professional efficiency that suggested either CIA extraction teams or psychiatric emergency response units. Their presence might represent the implementation of the termination protocol he had discovered, or it might be another layer of hallucination generated by his expectation of intervention based on the psychological evaluation documents. Someone knocked on his apartment door with the authoritative persistence of law enforcement or intelligence personnel conducting official business. A voice called his name and requested that he open the door voluntarily to avoid any unnecessary complications or potential safety issues. But Horace realized that he could no longer trust any action he might take to represent genuine choice, rather than predetermined behavior patterns built into whatever psychological conditioning or experimental protocols might be governing his experience. If Operation Mindbridge was real, then even his current responses to apparent intervention might be anticipated outcomes designed to generate additional research data. The knocking continued with increasing urgency, and Horace could hear personnel discussing forced entry procedures through his door. Their conversation suggested they were operating under medical rather than legal authority, which could indicate either psychiatric intervention or CIA containment procedures designed to prevent security breaches by psychologically compromised personnel. Horace looked around his apartment at the elaborate research displays covering every wall surface. Months of intensive analysis had either revealed genuine insights into CIA intelligence operations spanning decades, or had documented the progressive psychological breakdown of an analyst whose obsessive personality had been systematically exploited for experimental purposes. The most terrifying realization was that both interpretations might be simultaneously correct. His analytical discoveries might be legitimate while also representing the predictable responses of a test subject whose psychological vulnerabilities had been deliberately exploited to study the limits of intelligence analysis procedures. As his apartment door was breached by personnel whose identities and intentions remained fundamentally uncertain, Horace experienced a moment of absolute clarity that was somehow more terrifying than all the confusion that had preceded it. The men entering his apartment wore the dark suits and professional demeanor of CIA security personnel, but their faces seemed strangely familiar, as if he had seen them before in photographs or surveillance footage from his months of document analysis. "Mr. Fitzgerald, we're here to help you," the lead figure said, approaching with the careful movements of someone trained to manage psychologically unstable individuals. "Director Patterson has authorized us to provide you with medical assistance and secure transportation to a facility where you can receive appropriate treatment." But as the man spoke, Horace recognized his voice as one of the phantom conversations he had been hearing for weeks. This was the same person who had been discussing his psychological condition and research discoveries from adjacent apartments, which meant either that his auditory hallucinations had been more accurate than he realized, or that the voices had never been hallucinations at all. "You're the ones who have been monitoring me," Horace said, backing away from the advancing personnel while his mind raced through the implications of this recognition. "You've been conducting surveillance operations and discussing my case for weeks. This isn't a medical intervention. It's the implementation of the termination protocol I found in my files." The lead operative exchanged glances with his colleagues, and Horace caught a brief expression that might have been surprise at his level of awareness about their activities. "Mr. Fitzgerald, you've been experiencing severe psychological disturbances that have affected your perception of reality. The voices you've been hearing and the surveillance activities you believe you've observed are symptoms of your deteriorating mental condition." But this explanation felt wrong in ways that Horace's analytical training helped him recognize. If the voices had been purely internal hallucinations, how could this operative's voice match so perfectly with the phantom conversations he had been documenting? The consistency was too precise to be coincidental, which suggested that at least some aspects of the surveillance he had been experiencing were genuine rather than psychological projections. "Show me your CIA credentials," Horace demanded, though he knew that genuine agency personnel wouldn't be required to identify themselves during authorized operations. "I want to verify your authority to conduct medical interventions on former CIA employees." Instead of producing identification, the operative gestured to his colleagues, who began moving to flank Horace from different directions with the tactical coordination of a team that had clearly rehearsed this specific intervention scenario. Their movements were too professional and too coordinated to represent improvised responses to an unexpected situation. "Mr. Fitzgerald, we're going to need you to come with us voluntarily to avoid any unnecessary complications," the operative continued, maintaining his calm professional tone despite Horace's obvious resistance. "Your psychological condition requires immediate medical attention, and we have facilities specifically designed to help CIA personnel who have experienced operational stress." But Horace noticed that none of the operatives had mentioned specific details about his research project, his discoveries about the Perpetual Operations Framework, or his theories about ongoing CIA activities. If this was genuinely a medical intervention triggered by psychological breakdown, wouldn't they reference the specific delusions and paranoid theories that had supposedly motivated their involvement? The absence of any discussion about his analytical conclusions suggested that the operatives were more concerned with containing his access to information than with addressing his mental health. which implied that at least some aspects of his research might have revealed genuinely sensitive intelligence, rather than representing pure psychological fantasy. "I want to speak with Director Patterson directly before I go anywhere with you," Horace said, moving toward his kitchen telephone while keeping the operatives in sight. "If this is a legitimate medical intervention authorized by CIA leadership, then she should be available to confirm the protocols being implemented." But when Horace reached for the phone, he discovered that the line was dead. Not busy or disconnected, but completely silent in a way that suggested the communications infrastructure to his apartment had been deliberately severed. This level of operational preparation indicated systematic planning rather than emergency response to a psychological crisis. "Communications to this location have been temporarily suspended for security reasons," the operative explained, though his tone had become noticeably less patient. "Your phone calls over the past weeks have raised concerns about potential security breaches that require immediate containment." This admission confirmed Horace's suspicions that his apartment had been under comprehensive surveillance throughout his weeks at home, which meant that his theories about systematic monitoring by CIA personnel had been accurate rather than paranoid delusions. But this recognition raised even more disturbing questions about which other aspects of his experience might have been genuine intelligence operations, rather than psychological breakdown symptoms. "If you've been monitoring my communications, then you know that I never contacted any unauthorized personnel about classified information," Horace replied, trying to buy time while he assessed potential escape routes from his apartment. "My phone calls were limited to attempts to verify information with official CIA personnel who claimed not to exist." The operative's expression became more focused, as if Horace had revealed information that was particularly significant for their operational objectives. "Mr. Fitzgerald, your attempts to contact Bernice Kowalski and verify details about your research project have been documented as evidence of your deteriorating psychological condition. These individuals never existed, and your memories of working with them represent fabricated experiences generated by your mind under extreme stress." But this explanation contradicted Horace's clear memories of months of detailed consultation meetings with Bernice, during which she had demonstrated extensive knowledge about historical CIA operations and had provided specific guidance about document analysis procedures. Either his memories of these interactions were entirely fictional, or Bernice had been operating under a false identity as part of a compartmentalized operation that these intervention personnel weren't fully informed about. "Bernice provided me with detailed information about Cold War intelligence operations that I had no prior knowledge of," Horace said, watching the operatives' faces for any indication that they recognized the significance of this claim. If she was a psychological projection, how could she have known specific details about classified operations that weren't included in the documents I was analyzing? This question seemed to create some uncertainty among the operatives, who exchanged glances that suggested they hadn't been briefed on all aspects of Horace's research activities. Their momentary confusion implied that his case might be more complex than they had been led to believe, which could indicate competing factions or compartmentalized operations within the CIA's handling of his situation. The lead operative recovered his professional composure and approached Horace with renewed determination. "Mr. Fitzgerald, these theoretical questions about your research project can be addressed during your medical evaluation. Right now, we need to focus on getting you appropriate psychiatric care before your condition deteriorates further." But as the operative spoke, Horace noticed that his colleagues were positioning themselves to prevent escape, rather than to provide medical assistance. Their tactical deployment resembled containment procedures designed to capture potentially dangerous individuals, rather than therapeutic intervention protocols for helping psychologically disturbed personnel. "You're not medical personnel," Horace realized with a clarity that cut through weeks of uncertainty and paranoid speculation. "You're operational security specialists trained to contain intelligence breaches and eliminate security risks. This isn't about helping me. It's about preventing me from revealing information that could compromise ongoing CIA activities." The operative's mask of professional concern finally slipped, revealing the cold calculation of someone trained in counterintelligence operations. "Mr. Fitzgerald, your psychological breakdown has made you a potential security risk that requires immediate containment. Whether that containment takes the form of medical treatment or more permanent solutions depends entirely on your cooperation." This direct threat confirmed Horace's worst fears about the true nature of his situation. His months of document analysis had apparently revealed information sensitive enough to justify eliminating him as a potential security breach, which meant that at least some of his discoveries about the perpetual operations framework and ongoing CIA activities had been accurate rather than delusional. But this recognition also meant that his paranoid theories about systematic surveillance and psychological experimentation might have been correct, which raised terrifying questions about the extent to which his entire experience had been manipulated by intelligence professionals studying his responses to impossible situations. "The files I analyzed contained information about operations that are still classified at levels beyond my clearance," Horace said, trying to use his analytical discoveries as leverage for negotiating better treatment. "If you eliminate me, you'll never know which specific operations I learned about or what conclusions I drew from the evidence." The operative considered this argument for several long, about systematic psychological experimentation. His months of intensive document analysis had indeed been a controlled experiment, but that didn't necessarily mean that the information he had analyzed was fictional or that his analytical conclusions were invalid. "So, the perpetual operations framework is real," Horace concluded, watching the operatives' faces for confirmation of his most significant research discovery. "You created an experimental situation to study how I would respond to discovering evidence of ongoing intelligence operations, but the operations themselves are genuine." The operative's expression became carefully neutral, suggesting that Horace had identified information that was classified beyond the level these personnel were authorized to discuss. "Mr. Fitzgerald, the specific details of your research conclusions are not relevant to our current operational objectives. Our instructions are to secure your cooperation in medical treatment or implement alternative containment protocols." But Horace understood that this non-denial was actually confirmation of his analytical discoveries. If the perpetual operations framework had been entirely fictional, the operative would have stated that directly rather than deflecting the question with references to classification levels and operational security. "You're going to eliminate me because I discovered that CIA operations from the Cold War are still being implemented using the same methodologies and personnel networks," Horace said, finally understanding the complete scope of what his research had revealed. The historical files weren't just historical. They were documentation of ongoing activities disguised as declassified materials. The operative's response was immediate and decisive. He gestured to his colleagues, who moved to physically restrain Horace before he could continue his analytical conclusions. But as they approached, Horace realized that even his current situation might be another layer of the psychological experiment designed to study how intelligence personnel would respond to discovering the artificial nature of their own experiences. "How do I know that this intervention isn't just another component of Operation Mindbridge?" Horace asked as the operatives surrounded him. "Maybe my psychological breakdown, your arrival, even this conversation are all scripted elements designed to study my responses to different levels of perceived threat." This possibility seemed to give the operatives pause, as if they themselves weren't entirely certain about the boundaries between experimental manipulation and genuine operational activity. Their momentary uncertainty suggested that Horace's case might involve levels of compartmentalized deception that exceeded even their operational briefing. "The experiment ends now," the lead operative said, though his tone lacked the confidence he had displayed earlier. "Whatever psychological manipulation you may have experienced during your research project, this intervention represents genuine CIA security procedures." But as Horace felt restraints being applied to his arms, he realized that the question of authenticity might be impossible to resolve. If intelligence operations could involve multiple layers of deception and compartmentalized manipulation, then distinguishing between experimental scenarios and genuine security procedures might be beyond the capabilities of any individual participant, including the operatives themselves. The last coherent thought that passed through Horace's consciousness as pharmaceutical sedation began to take effect was the recognition that his situation represented the ultimate achievement of intelligence methodology. A scenario so thoroughly compartmentalized and multiplied deceptive that no participant could determine which aspects were genuine and which were experimental, including the researchers who had designed the deception in the first place. As consciousness faded, Horace understood that he had discovered something far more disturbing than evidence of ongoing CIA operations. He had encountered the possibility that intelligence work had evolved to a level of systematic deception, where the categories of real and artificial, observer and observed, researcher and subject, had become so thoroughly intermingled that the intelligence community itself might no longer be able to distinguish between genuine operations and psychological experiments designed to study the very personnel who were conducting them. Whether Horace Fitzgerald had been a brilliant analyst who discovered uncomfortable truths about CIA activities, or a test subject whose psychological breakdown had been orchestrated to study the limits of intelligence analysis, or something far more complex that transcended these simple categories, remained a question that might be unanswerable even by the intelligence professionals who had created his impossible situation.